Chapter 708. The third eye was slightly closed at this moment. As it opened and closed, an extremely deep light shone out from it. All spacetime was illuminated by this light, and it seemed as if all secrets had been completely taken by this light, no longer being able to keep any secrets. First text, free download of an ebook. This figure was tall and muscular, and the lines on his body were extremely perfect. It seemed as if every rise and fall and every vibration of his muscles contained the supreme secrets of endless spacetime. Looking at his appearance, there were extremely strong traces of Luo Fan, as if it was Luo Fan's appearance that had been formed after some changes. At this moment, the aura around the three-eyed person seemed extraordinary, but whether it was the strength of his body or the strength of his soul, it was only like that of an ordinary person. At most, it was just that the materials and energy used to construct it were of an extremely high level, so its aptitude had reached an unimaginable level. Not to mention compared to Luo Fan at this moment, even if he was compared to any innate god in the primordial world, he was countless of times inferior. If he were to appear in the primordial world at this moment, then even a wave of violent fluctuation of energy might cause his soul to disperse and completely vanish into nothingness. This body was actually not a living being, but a magic treasure that Luo Fan had refined. It was an extremely strange magic treasure that did not have any characteristics of a magic treasure other than a complete spiritual consciousness. It did not have the power of any magic treasure, and it was even far inferior to the power of even the weakest magic treasure. However, it had a spiritual consciousness that was no different from living beings, and it also had the characteristics that living beings could continuously improve through self-cultivation. In other words, this was a completely new magic treasure that was a living magic treasure. In the eyes of any cultivator, this kind of magic treasure could already be said to be a real living being. This was because no matter from which angle, it was impossible to see the difference between this magic treasure and a real living being. However, only the owner of this magic treasure, Luo Fan, knew that this thing was just a magic treasure. This was because there were layers of restrictions where the origin of this thing's life was located. These restrictions contained the secrets of the existence of countless living beings. They possessed everything that living beings needed, but they were still restrictions. It was precisely because of this essence that even though this item seemed to be completely the same as a living creature, it was still only a magic treasure. Jili Boy greets Master. The man slowly opened his eyes and bowed respectfully to Luo Fan. Although he was an extremely muscular man, he called himself a boy. It seemed so natural, as if not calling himself a boy was a form of rebellion against the great Tao. That was the right thing to do. At that moment, the one speaking was none other than the treasure spirit of the treasure. As for the treasure spirit of a magic treasure, no matter how big it looked, even if it was an old man, it was still only a child. After all, as a treasure spirit, no matter how much it looked like a living being, there were still some differences between it and a real living being. This difference meant that these magical treasures could only be magical treasures and not living beings. Thus, they could only call themselves children. This was the rule of the Great Tao, not something that Luo Fan had purposely set up. Luo Fan calmly said, "I didn't create you for any important task. You only need to complete one thing, and that is to learn the ninely heavenly scripture within your restrictions." Ninely Daybreak. When the child Jili heard Luo Fan's words, his expression did not change. He bowed and stood up. He walked to the side, sat down, and began to cultivate. The ninely heavenly scripture was the cultivation technique that Luo Fan had created through the information of the saint's body. Because it came from a certain saint in the ninely great world, and it had been cultivated to contain that saint's body, Luo Fan had named it the ninely heavenly scripture. The reason why this magic treasure was called Ninely Child was because Luo Fan had directly used the name of the cultivation method to name the magic treasure. This magic treasure's name was Ninely Heavenly Scripture. There were no advertisements. From this, it could be seen that the Ninely child looked no different from an ordinary person. However, in reality, he was only a magic treasure after all. He was still different from a real living being. At the very least, normal living beings would not be able to sit down and cultivate in such a straightforward and naked manner. Luo Fan's cultivation of the Tao heart had already reached the great perfection realm. He did not care about the Ninely child's actions at all, nor did he have any intention of helping him change his clothes to cover himself. Instead, he looked at the Ninely child quietly and waited for him to cultivate. The Ninely child's body contained the power to construct the projection of a saint's body. This power was now hidden within his body. Although he couldn't use it, it was still very powerful. Although he could not use it, as long as he continued to cultivate, the power could continuously transform into his cultivation and support his cultivation. As a result, before the Ninely child completely absorbed all the power contained in the projection, he did not need to ask for any power from the outside world. Although the projection was only a projection condensed by the primordial world to welcome the arrival of a saint, and the difference between it and a saint was like the difference between heaven and earth, it was only compared to a saint-level existence. The power it contained was so powerful that even a supreme existence at the peak of the zenith heaven metal Tao would not be able to completely absorb it. In other words, as long as the body could not become a chaotic spirit treasure on the same level as the primordial chaos Tao fruit, and could not become a supreme Tao throne like a cultivator becoming a saint, it would be impossible for it to completely absorb the power contained in the projection. Unless there was a saint refining it, it would be extremely difficult for a magic treasure to become a chaotic spirit treasure. It would be hundreds of millions of times more difficult than becoming a saint. From this, it could be seen that with the power of the projection in his body, the Ninely child no longer needed to absorb any power from the outside world. To a certain extent, he had become self-sufficient and was not restricted by the external environment. It was precisely because of this that the Ninely child was sitting cross-legged and cultivating. The power in his body was constantly increasing, but he was not affected at all by the outside world. It was as if he was completely separated from the outside world. This was the world of Luo Fan's sea of consciousness. After the various changes that had happened before, it had fused with his soul. As a result, nothing in the sea of consciousness could escape his senses. The Ninely child was a magic treasure refined by Luo Fan, so it was no exception. As a result, with just a thought from Luo Fan, all of the changes within the Ninely boy's body were revealed in his eyes. This included some of the extremely subtle and obscure changes that even the Ninely boy himself found difficult to detect. In the depths of Jili child's body, there was an extremely deep and obscure spacetime. Strands of strange energy constantly seeped out, washing through Jili child's body and gradually gathering in his dantian. This strange power was extremely subtle, but every strand of power contained an unimaginable power. Just a strand of it was enough to suppress any loose immortal to the point that they couldn't move. It was even to the extent that, if the pressure was just a little bit heavier, that loose immortal would probably collapse and perish. However, such power did not pressure the Jili child in the slightest. Instead, it made Jili boy feel extremely comfortable. He felt that his body and spiritual sense had obtained incredible benefits from the cleansing of this power. According to the Ninely heavenly scripture, which was recorded in the depths of his restriction, he continuously circulated the power in his dantian, allowing it to slowly flow out of his dantian. It began to slowly circulate in his body according to a mysterious and extremely complicated path. As the power circulated, its nature constantly changed. It even caused the Ninely child's spirit, and body to undergo an extremely subtle change. His cultivation continued to rise at an unimaginable speed during this process. Qi refinement, core formation, divine flame, spirit reversion, and adversity passing. He only spent 9 days and 9 nights before breaking through the 5 great loose immortal realms. After 9 days and 9 nights, the Ninely boy had already become an existence at the peak of the crossing disaster realm. His body was tens of thousands of times stronger than when he was first created. The power that seeped out from the deep spacetime in his body had completely changed form, turning into a mysterious yuan energy that contained endless power. This power was even over 100 times more powerful than the power of the Tao fruit realm before it became an immortal Tao. Due to the boundless power in his body, the power of the Ninely child's ability was pushed to an unimaginable level for adversity passing. It was even more powerful than ordinary loose immortals. Even loose immortals who cultivated the Tao fruit realm might only be able to put up a stalemate against him. If news of the power of the ability spread, it would be enough to stun anyone. It would make them willing to give up everything for the Ninely heavens scripture. However, that was only for ordinary people. For the Jili child and Luo Fan, who were watching the Jili child cultivate, it wasn't worth mentioning at all. The man and treasure didn't pay any attention to it at all. After all, both of them knew very well that the reason the child of Jili was able to cultivate the heavenly scripture of Jili to the peak below the immortal Tao in 9 days and 9 nights was because of the power that seeped out from an extremely deep and mysterious spacetime in the depths of his body. This power was the power that formed the projection of the saint. Its level was so high that it far exceeded the imagination of all living beings. It was because of this high level of power that the Ninely child was able to condense the origin energy of the Ninely heavens scripture so easily and push his cultivation to the peak of adversity passing so easily. If other cultivators cultivated the Ninely heavens scripture, they would need who knows how many tens of thousands of years to cultivate the origin energy required. If they wanted to push the Ninely heavens scripture to adversity passing, it would probably take another tens of thousands of years. As a result, it was better to directly cultivate other cultivation methods. If they cultivated other cultivation methods, it would only take tens of thousands of years to reach adversity passing from nothing. If they were lucky and cultivated a cultivation method that was suitable for them, they would even be able to do it in a few hundred years. In comparison, the Ninely heavens scripture was not worth it for ordinary cultivators. It was not worth it for them to pursue. It was because he understood this that Luo Fan was not moved by the fact that the Ninely heavens scripture could push the Ninely child to the peak of adversity passing so quickly. He did not want to pass down the Ninely heavens scripture for his own disciples to cultivate. The Ninely child was already a magic treasure. Although it was a magic treasure that focused all its power on spiritual sense and talent, it did not have any power or cultivation. It was still a magic treasure after all. It was a magic treasure that transcended life and death and was equivalent to an itinerant immortal. Since that was the case, the bottleneck between adversity passing and earthly immortal was naturally extremely weak. As a result, the Ninely child did not prepare much. With just a collision of origin energy, it naturally broke through the bottleneck. Its origin energy instantly transformed into a type of magic power that was completely different from Luo Fan's magic power and any Tao fruit's magic power. This kind of magic power was condensed into one. There were no tiny units inside it. It was as if it was already the finest, purest, and most complete whole. It could not be further divided. The transformation of origin energy into magic power naturally led to changes in the Ninely child's body, spiritual sense, sea of consciousness, and soul. In an instant, the Ninely child's body trembled and the third eye between his eyebrows suddenly opened. A mysterious and deep light rushed out of the eye and swept in all directions. Wherever the light swept, the structure of time and space seemed to unfold without any reservation. It was as if at this moment, all the mysteries of the universe were completely absorbed by the light and were instantly understood by the Ninely child. Even Luo Fan could not help but feel as if some of his body's secrets were being taken in by the light. However, this feeling was very slight. Luo Fan only had a slight thought, and he knew that this light had not invaded his body at all. It had only slightly touched his body. Not to mention the secret of his body, even if it wanted to really touch his body, it would not be able to do so. However, this had already made Luo Fan feel inexplicably shocked. After all, the Ninely Child had only just broken through the adversity stage and attained the immortal Tao, and he wasn't even an immortal cultivator yet. Compared to Luo Fan, he was weak to the point he could simply be ignored. However, such a weak existence was actually able to touch his body with his gaze. This had simply surpassed the great Tao and transcended the laws. How could he not be shocked? So, this is the true saint's eye. Previously, I used the third eye of the saint's body to observe the universe's spacetime, but I'm afraid I only used a tiny bit of its power. Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Although the gaze seemed to have seen through all the mysteries of the universe, in reality, it did not gain much. After all, this was not anywhere else, but Luo Fan's sea of consciousness. If it was anywhere else, even in the primordial world, the light of the third eye would definitely be able to obtain the endless mysteries of the primordial world's spacetime. It would even be able to obtain all sorts of incredible abilities and power. It would be able to do countless things that independent immortals could not do in the primordial world. However, in Luo Fan's sea of consciousness, the situation was completely different. The sea of consciousness had already fused with Luo Fan. It could be said that the sea of consciousness was Luo Fan's soul. On the other hand, the Jili child's third eye could not truly come into contact with Luo Fan's soul. Under such circumstances, how could he see through the sea of consciousness that was also his soul? It was already extremely rare to be able to gain something. However, the changes to the Ninely Child did not stop because of this. The Ninely Child let out a long roar and his body involuntarily floated up. The light of his third eye shot up into the sky as he raised his head. It was as if it wanted to illuminate the sky and see the truth beyond the sky. His body involuntarily stretched out, as if he wanted to try his best to bring the entire world into his arms. Then, the sound of silk ripping could be heard. 2 pairs of arms suddenly grew out from under the Ninely Child's ribs. These 2 pairs of arms were exactly the same as the original arms. They were just as tough and powerful. With a slight turn, it was no longer possible to tell which 2 pairs of arms were the original arms and which 2 pairs of arms had just appeared. After the 2 pairs of arms grew out, the junction between the Ninely Child's shoulders and neck shook. 2 heads suddenly popped out. These 2 heads were exactly the same as the original head. After they appeared, they also raised their heads and opened their third eyes, shooting out a beam of light that seemed to illuminate the world. Then, the 3 heads turned slightly. It was also impossible to tell which one was the original and which 2 had just grown out. As the 4 arms and 2 heads grew out, the Ninely Child turned into a 3-headed, 6-armed body in the blink of an eye. The magic power in his body instantly increased by 100 times, and the strength of his body also increased by more than 100 times. In the blink of an eye, he had completely stepped into the rogue immortal realm. In fact, he had even reached the peak of the rogue immortal realm. He could barely fight against true immortals who cultivated the Tao fruit. 3 heads and 6 arms was originally an extremely deformed body. However, when Luo Fan looked at the Ninely Child's 3-headed, 6-armed body, he felt a sense of perfection wash over him. The 3-headed, 6-armed body did not have the slightest bit of disharmony. The entire body looked extremely perfect. Compared to it, it seemed like a normal person with 1 head and 2 arms was not perfect. So this is the true 3-headed, 6-armed body. A strange thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. #free ebook download. Chapter 709. The cultivation of the 3 heads and 6 arms technique was not an unbelievable mystical ability to Luo Fan. Text starter. No advertisements, full text, updates. Back then, when he obtained Pangu's primordial spirit and used all his memories to create the endless technique, the 3-headed, six-armed body was already included in it. Even the three eyes technique did not exceed the scope of those techniques. Therefore, under normal circumstances, the three-headed, six-armed body and the third eye that the ninely child had appeared should not contain any incomprehensible mysteries to him. He did not need to have such thoughts because of that. However, the three-headed, six-armed body and the three eyes technique that he had created were fundamentally different from the three-headed, six-armed body and the three eyes technique that the ninely child had cultivated. This difference was extremely huge. Apart from the slight similarity between the two, there was nothing else in common. The three-headed, six-armed, three-eyed technique was a mystical ability that many immortals possessed in myths and legends. Although this mystical ability was magical, in Luo Fan's impression, at least in the legends, it was just an ordinary mystical ability. Although it could greatly increase the combat power of immortals, it was not like there was no way to resist it. Even the power of the three eyes technique was only able to see through illusions and see through all kinds of concealment. Even if it was said to be able to see through the heavens and see through the nine hells, it was only able to unleash these abilities to a certain limit. Although these powers were magical, they were not unbelievable compared to the power of the mystical abilities of immortals. However, at that moment, the three-headed, six-armed body and the three eyes technique that appeared on the ninely child's body were definitely not something that the power of the mystical abilities that Luo Fan had deduced in the past could compare to. The three-headed, six-armed body that appeared on the ninely child's body was not a mystical ability, but a cultivation technique of the Great Tao. It was a supreme cultivation technique that led straight to the level of the primordial spirit and transcended the world. When he cultivated this Dharma to the limit, he would be immortal even if the world decayed, and he would not perish even if the world was destroyed. Even if the primordial world disappeared without a trace, he would be able to continue living in the chaotic state and would never be harmed. From a certain point of view, this sort of cultivation technique wasn't any weaker than Luo Fan's Tao fruit at all. How could the three heads and six arms divine ability that Luo Fan had created in the past compare to this? Furthermore, the three eyes art could be separated, and it could also be treated as a component of the three heads and six arms body. If it was looked at separately, then the three eyes technique was a supreme technique of the eyes. When cultivated to the peak, one would possess the eyes of a saint, and one would be able to see through everything. Thus, one would obtain the supreme might of omniscient and omniscient like a saint. To a certain extent, one would already be close to a saint. Even if one could not rely on the three eyes technique to achieve immortality, it could reduce the difficulty of achieving immortality by hundreds of millions of times. How could the three eyes technique that Luo Fan had created previously, which could only allow one to see through illusions and see through all kinds of disguises, compare to it? It was precisely because he realized this that Luo Fan sighed with emotion that the three heads and six arms body in front of him was the real three heads and six arms body. I wonder if the three heads and six arms body created by the saint in the legendary primordial world is the one I created before, or this one. I wonder why they created such a technique. This question suddenly flashed across Luo Fan's mind. As soon as this question appeared, he suddenly felt that the primordial world legend that he thought was extremely clear in the past was suddenly shrouded in a faint layer of fog. It seemed that there was a deeper secret in the primordial world legend, a secret that he did not want to believe but was very likely to be the truth. This secret was unacceptable to Luo Fan, but in fact it was not difficult for him to think of it. In the primordial world legend, there was no existence related to the Jili Great World, nor were there any traces of foreign creatures appearing in the primordial world. It was as if the primordial world was the only world in the entire chaotic state, and it was the most high-level existence in the entire chaotic state. This understanding penetrated all the legend. Even if there were differences, It was only in the legends of some major thousand worlds, medium thousand worlds, and minor thousand worlds under the primordial world. This understanding was obviously worlds apart from the real truth. Even at the beginning of the primordial world, there were existences from the Jilly Great World who had infiltrated the primordial world through some methods that Luo Fan still did not understand. In the end, they were discovered by Luo Fan by chance and died. However, because of their death, the saint's will of the Jilly Great World descended, causing the four-faced and eight-armed existence at the peak of the zenith heaven golden path to descend into the primordial world not long ago. Obviously, Luo Fan did not exist in the legends of the primordial world. It was because of the existence of Luo Fan that the existence that had infiltrated the Jilly Great World had been exposed in the primordial world. In that case, there was probably only one reason why there was no legend of the Jilly Great World in the legends of the primordial world. The existence of the Jilly Great World had integrated into the primordial world, and might even have occupied an unimaginably high position. It might even have controlled the primordial world, causing the primordial world to be controlled by the Jilly Great World from a certain point of view. This secret was so sensational, but it could be figured out with just a little thought. Although Lu Fatsi did not dare to believe it, he vaguely felt that this secret probably existed. If this secret existed, then the cultivation method of the 3 heads and 6 arms technique and the 3 eyes technique would naturally appear. After all, other than a saint, he could not think of any other person who could occupy an unimaginably high position that could hide it from the entire primordial world. No living creature in the primordial world, not even a saint, not even Hong Jun, could know of the existence of the Jilly Great World. Since he was a saint, then it was naturally not just a matter of a thought for him to create a cultivation method that was similar to the body of a saint that he had seen in the Jilly Great World. From the existence of the 3 heads and 6 arms technique and the 3 eyes technique, Luo Fan suddenly saw an incomparably huge Yin shadow enveloping the primordial world. This Yin shadow was so huge that it made Luo Fan feel like he couldn't resist it at this time. If that's really the case, then I'll just make that 4-faced, 8-armed existence retreat. I won't let the Jilly Great World stop. After all, there will be even more powerful people from the Jilly Great World coming to the primordial world. At that time, what method should I use to resist? An indescribable sense of vigilance suddenly surged in Luo Fan's mind. In the legends, it was clearly impossible for a single living being from the Jilly Great World to be able to control the primordial world so firmly. Since it was not something that could be done by a single living being, there must be an even more powerful force behind that incident. And if such a powerful force wanted to control the primordial world, it must have had a deep consideration. It was impossible for it to give up just because of some speculation from the 4-faced, 8-armed existence. Thinking about this, an indescribable sense of urgency suddenly surged in Luo Fan's heart. As soon as this feeling appeared, he suddenly realized that the matter of the Jilly child cultivating the cultivation method of the body of a saint could no longer attract his attention. With a thought, he raised his hand and waved his soul. The Jilly child shook slightly and disappeared from his sea of consciousness. When he reappeared, he directly appeared in the Void Wuji Palace, in the only colossal world. The colossal world was the highest and most powerful world in the Void Wuji Palace. The level of this world was so high that it could even accommodate countless cultivators in the 3 realms of primordial unity to cultivate. Not to mention that the Jilly child did not need to absorb energy from the outside world. Even if he did, it would be enough for him to cultivate to the 3 realms of primordial heaven. Although the Jilly child could only rely on 9 days and 9 nights to become an itinerant immortal from an ordinary person, at this time, his cultivation speed had gradually begun to slow down. It was absolutely impossible to break through to the itinerant immortal realm without hundreds of years. It was even more impossible to break through to the perfected immortal realm without thousands of years. The following golden immortal realm, Tai itinerant immortal, Tai true immortal, and Tai golden immortal, the time needed to break through each realm was hundreds or even thousands of times more than the previous realm. In the end, if he wanted to break through to the 3 realms of primordial heaven, the difficulty would reach an unimaginable level. After all, although the power hidden in the depths of his body could allow him to cultivate without external help, there was no shortcut to the improvement of his cultivation realm. He was a magic weapon refined by Luo Fan and had a trace of Luo Fan's cultivation. Therefore, before the 3 realms of primordial heaven, the bottleneck to break through was tens of thousands of times weaker than that of ordinary cultivators. But after all, what he had obtained was only a trace of Luo Fan's cultivation, and Luo Fan was, after all, only in the true path of the great Luo. It was extremely rare that a trace of his cultivation could weaken the bottleneck before the zenith heaven. How could it affect the bottleneck to break through to the zenith heaven from primordial heaven? Therefore, if the Jili child wanted to become a Daluo heaven treasure, although it was much easier to break through than a normal magic weapon, it was no less difficult than a normal cultivator becoming a disbanded immortal of the great all-embracing heaven. Therefore, it could be said that if the Jili child wanted to cultivate a Daluo heaven treasure in the boundless Void Palace's vast thousand world, it would take hundreds of billions of years to be able to achieve it. And at that time, to what extent would Luo Fan's cultivation realm be improved, and to what extent would the boundless Void Palace be improved, who could say for sure? Naturally, there was no need to worry that the vast thousand world would be damaged because of the Jili child's cultivation in it. The Jili child did not care about Luo Fan's actions at all. When the void changed, he still had 3 heads and 6 arms, and the light emitted by his 3 third eyes still shot straight into the sky, trying hard to see through all the mysteries of the universe. However, although the boundless Void Palace was only one of Luo Fan's magic weapons, it was completely integrated with Luo Fan. From another point of view, it could also be said to be a part of Luo Fan. Therefore, although his 3 third eyes could see through many more mysteries in the vast thousand world than in the sea of knowledge, it was impossible to gain as much as it did in the outside world. Even through the vast thousand world, he could not see the other medium and small thousand world. He could not even see the true appearance of the boundless Void Palace. After a while, the Jili child came back to his senses. The light emitted by the 3 third eyes gradually converged, and finally disappeared. He slowly lowered his 3 heads, and his body swayed slightly. His 6 arms grabbed the void in an extremely agile manner, and the void of the vast thousand world seemed to have become bouncy rubber. With a light grab, the void changed shape. His body trembled slightly, and the time around him seemed to distort violently. It was as if it had become independent of the vast thousand world, and had become a flow of time that was specially adapted to the Jili child. This flow of time that was specially adapted to the Jili child did not simply speed up, nor did it simply slow down. Instead, it was changing in a very mysterious way, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, and faintly seemed to be doing some kind of mysterious breathing. This method of changing time was only suitable for the Jili child. For other living beings, unless they possessed a divine ability like Luo Fan's, once they entered this rhythm of time, they would most likely be directly sensed by the rhythm of time itself and fall into a boundless state of inappropriateness. From then on, they would never be able to truly return to reality. This was the most basic and wondrous power that the 3-headed, 6-armed body brought. This characteristic that called itself spacetime and adapted to time was a characteristic that only a sage's body had. Of course, the Jili child had only just become an itinerant immortal. This characteristic was still extremely weak. Compared to a true sage, it was like the difference between heaven and earth. If a sage's body had this characteristic, it could even affect a perfect world, allowing the entire world's time to naturally adapt to his existence. However, it was precisely because it was so powerful that it did not have much effect on living beings. because the formidableness of this special trait had already exceeded the limits, and it had even attained the state of being able to affect the rhythm of time of living beings and assimilate it. As a result, even if living beings stepped into it, they would not lose themselves. Instead, they would feel extremely comfortable and at ease. Of course, this was only the effect of this characteristic when it was at its strongest. To omnipotent sages, it was naturally extremely easy to control the strength of this characteristic, its range of influence, and its receptors. If he was willing, the assimilation effect of this characteristic on living beings could be eliminated at any time, although it might cause the living beings of the entire perfect world to completely lose themselves and be completely lost. This was a small reason why sages were invincible. It was also a small reason that could almost be ignored. In reality, at the level of a sage, the form of existence of living beings had already surpassed the world and the great Tao. Even the slightest, simplest, and least special characteristic on their bodies was something that ordinary living beings and cultivators could not bear. It could be said that this was the reason why they were invincible. For example, sages did not breathe in and out spiritual qi. Instead, they breathed in and out the world and Hun Yuan. With a single movement, they could even cause a storm of Hun Yuan in the perfect world, causing the entire world to become extremely Huanyuan. As a result, all living beings in it, including peak zenith heaven golden path cultivators, would be completely annihilated. Another example was the aura of sages that surpassed the world and the great Tao. A slight tremble could cause the great Tao to change, causing the world to move and change the existence of the world. It could make it unsuitable for any living being to survive, thus erasing all living beings in a perfect world. Hence, from a certain point of view, investigating the fundamental reason why sages were invincible was like an ant considering why a divine dragon was invincible to itself. It was definitely an extremely laughable matter. After the time and space around Zhili Boy changed, his body was at the peak of perfection. Whether it was his body, magic power, soul, or will, they had all reached a peak that could no longer be improved. His entire mind and will were filled with an indescribable sense of freedom. It was as if at this moment he was truly alive. At this moment, he had broken free from all restraints and had become his true self. Even time had changed its rhythm to accommodate him. What else in the great thousand world could truly restrain him? How could he not be at ease? However, there was a price for this kind of freedom. 15 minutes after the great thousand world passed, the boundless magic power in Zhili Boy's body had been completely exhausted. He could no longer maintain his three-headed and six-armed body. Even the third eye between his brows could not open and was tightly shut. The surrounding time and space that was affected by it had returned to its normal state, as if it had never changed. On the other hand, Zhili Boy had also broken free from that extremely free and unrestrained state. He once again felt the boundless restraint, as well as the restriction of time and space that was everywhere. If Zhili Boy had never experienced that kind of freedom, he would naturally not feel much about it. However, after experiencing that indescribable freedom, the feeling of being restrained by time and space made him feel extremely uncomfortable. He even wanted to roar at the sky to vent his depression and irritation. Fortunately, he was a treasure that had cultivated to the itinerant immortal realm. During the process of cultivation, his mental state had also been tempered. At this moment, his mental state was quite extraordinary. Thus, in the blink of an eye, he had already suppressed the depression and irritation. Letting out a long breath, he slowly relaxed his body. He did not choose any other place and directly sat down on a mountain in the great thousand world. He slowly circulated his cultivation technique and touched a certain mysterious space in the depths of his body, causing strands of strange energy to surge out. This allowed strands of magic power to be slowly produced in his body, gradually filling up his body and replenishing the exhaustion that had almost exhausted him. Chapter 710. Jilly Child was currently in the major kiliacosm within the limitless void palace. Naturally, everything that happened there could not escape Luo Fan's senses. Thus, he could see all the strange powers brought about by Jilly Child's three-headed and six-armed body. As a result, the strange power that the Ninely Child's three-headed, six-armed body brought was directly seen by him. Even though he did not pay much attention to Jilly Child, he could not help but sigh at the power of the saint's body. However, it was just a sigh. No matter how powerful the saint's body was, it did not mean much to him at that moment. However, he had more important things to do. With a slight thought, his consciousness returned to his body. He raised his eyes to look at the sky. His eyes pierced through the endless distance and spacetime. He saw Luo Fu's family of 4, who were hidden in the core of the Light Realm and had used the power of the leap when the Light Realm transformed from a minor kiliacosm to a medium kiliacosm to increase their cultivation realm. In his eyes, the auras of the 4 of them, the power in their bodies, and the changes in their souls in their sea of consciousness were not concealed at all. He could easily see through them. It is inevitable that Fu will obtain the Grand Unity Dao fruit. Although it is more difficult for Guangpu, it is not a big problem. After all, Chunyang and Guo's cultivation realm is too low. At most, they can only become golden immortals. It is a pity that this opportunity has been lost. In an instant, Luo Fan had already comprehended the benefits that the 4 of them could obtain by using the power of the Light Realm leap. After understanding this, he no longer cared about how they comprehended the mysteries. He raised his hand and waved. Several figures appeared in front of him. They were Lei Jiuxiao, Gu Ling, and Lin Tianan, as well as the 3 Khanate gods under Luo Fan. When Luo Fan collected the surviving living beings of the primordial world, the 6 of them had already been taken into the universe in Luo Fan's sleeve. In these hundreds of thousands of years, they had been staying in the universe in Luo Fan's sleeve. Although they could stay awake, it was difficult for them to cultivate and they could not improve their cultivation realm at all. This was naturally much worse than Luo Fu. However, compared to the other living beings who were muddle-headed and even felt that time had frozen, they were many times better. When the 6 of them appeared here, they noticed Luo Fan at first glance. They immediately acted like Luo Fu and the others. Before they noticed the changes in the surroundings of the great wasteland, they turned over and kowtowed, paying their respects. Luo Fan smiled slightly, raised his hand and lifted them up. He said, "This time, the great tribulation of the heavens and earth covers a wide area. I, your master, cannot protect you. I can only keep you in my sleeve. Don't be dissatisfied." When they heard Luo Fan's words, they naturally called him Master and Master Merciful. They would not be dissatisfied. They even wanted to dig out their hearts for Luo Fan to see to show that they were not lying. Luo Fan only glanced at them casually and smiled. He said, "Fortunately, the primordial world is still in the aftermath of the tribulation. The various changes have not completely stabilized. You can also carefully observe it. You will definitely obtain countless benefits. Here, I have a technique that can help you comprehend the changes." As he spoke, his thoughts moved slightly. There was no need for him to move. Endless light and shadows condensed in the void. In the blink of an eye, a large number of words and images condensed in front of him. They duplicated and split, turning into 6 rays of light. They directly rushed into the 6 people's sea of consciousness, allowing them to instantly understand the various mysteries recorded in those words and images. The technique on it was none other than a technique that Luo Fan had created previously. It was a technique that used the power of the mysterious existence that controlled the tribulation of the world to nourish himself. However, there were some slight changes. He removed some of the changes that Lei Jiuxiao and the rest could not understand at their current cultivation realm and added many methods of application. This change had greatly reduced the effects of the technique. At most, it could only activate the skin of the mysterious existence that Luo Fan could activate. What Luo Fan could activate was already the skin of the mysterious existence. Therefore, it was naturally impossible to use this technique to prove one's Tao and become a saint. However, even so, this technique was already unimaginably profound compared to the various techniques that the few of them had comprehended before. Perhaps only the techniques that Luo Fan had imparted back then could compare to it. Such a profound and indescribable technique was enough for them to spend their entire lives comprehending it. At the very least, it was naturally not difficult for them to break through their current realm. Therefore, after sensing this technique, Lei Jiuxiao and the rest only felt an indescribable joy. They were overjoyed and bowed again, thanking Luo Fan for imparting the technique. Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand to help them up. He said, "Go, go. This opportunity is really rare. If you delay any longer, it will be difficult to find it after it passes." When they heard that, they hurriedly bowed to Luo Fan again. Then, following their own wills, they left for various parts of the primordial world. Only Lei Jiuxiao lagged behind. After the others disappeared, Lei Jiuxiao returned to Luo Fan. Luo Fan was not surprised by Lei Jiuxiao's arrival at all. He looked at Lei Jiuxiao with a smile and did not speak. He waited for Lei Jiuxiao. Lei Jiuxiao was initially hesitant, but when he saw Luo Fan's gentle expression, he gritted his teeth and bowed to Luo Fan. He said, "I have a question in my heart. It has been suppressed for hundreds of thousands of years. I wonder if Master can explain it to me?" As he spoke, he kowtowed and did not get up, waiting for Luo Fan's answer. Luo Fan stopped smiling and sighed. "You really did say it out loud. I thought you had already thought it through. Master's abilities are limitless. You must know what I want to ask. I beg Master to explain it to me," Lei Jiuxiao said resolutely. Although he kowtowed, he gave off an extremely stubborn aura, as if he would not give up until he obtained an answer. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed again and raised his hand. Lei Jiuxiao stood up involuntarily. During the entire process, he did not even have the slightest intention to resist. He felt that only by standing up could he better express his thoughts. It was as if he was born to stand and not kneel on the ground. This situation was simply inconceivable to the demon ancestor who had controlled billions of demons for hundreds of yuan hui. After all, to all living beings in the untainted land, the demon ancestor Lei Jiuxiao was one of the two most powerful people in the entire untainted land apart from the Tao Master. How could such a powerful existence not be able to kneel? However, at this very moment everything seemed so natural. Even Lei Jiuxiao himself couldn't come up with any unacceptable ideas. After all, he, who had been included in the spirit space by Luo Fan for tens of millions of years, knew better than anyone else, including Hong Jun, Luo Fu, and even Lin Tiannan, who regarded Luo Fan's omnipotence as a belief. Therefore, even though he was already at the peak of the golden immortal realm and had even felt the power of primordial unity countless times, he still knew clearly that he was not even an ant in front of his master. His master could completely erase his existence with a thought and destroy all his efforts for tens of thousands of years. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not have the slightest doubt about what was happening at this moment. "You must be asking why I was so biased towards your second senior brother in the battle between you and your second senior brother." Luo Fan sighed. "That's exactly what I'm asking." Knowing that he could not resist Master's will, Lei Jiuxiao no longer insisted on kneeling. However, this was the third time he asked Master to forgive him. Obviously, this doubt had been suppressed in his heart for many years. This was also inevitable. Although Luo Fu was Master's son, he was also Master's disciple. Lei Jiuxiao naturally understood and expected that Master would be biased towards his second senior brother in the battle between him and second senior brother. However, Luo Fan's bias was too obvious and exaggerated. That bias was almost to the point of defeating Lei Jiuxiao himself. How could Lei Jiuxiao accept it when it was so obvious and exaggerated? It was already considered that he was strong-willed and rational, that he did not harbor any resentment in his heart. Hearing Lei Jiuxiao's words, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Disciple Jiuxiao, look at the primordial world. It is so vast and boundless, but the living beings in the entire world, even at the most prosperous time, are sparse compared to the entire world. Do you know how rare it is for me to be able to obtain a few of you as my disciples in such a desolate world?" As he spoke, Luo Fan pointed casually, and the entire primordial world seemed to be directly laid out in front of Lei Jiuxiao. Lei Jiuxiao was naturally influenced by it and felt his state of mind, as well as the primordial world in Luo Fan's eyes. At this moment, Luo Fan had already attained the zenith heaven truth Tao. Although he had only just stepped into it, his cultivation realm, the power of his divine abilities, and the senses of his eyes had already surpassed Lei Jiuxiao, who was at the peak of the golden immortal realm, by countless times. Under such circumstances, the world in Luo Fan's eyes was naturally indescribably shocking to Lei Jiuxiao. It instantly affected Lei Jiuxiao, making him suddenly feel that the dissatisfaction and doubt in his heart were so insignificant and not worth mentioning compared to the entire world. He murmured, "I understand. It is the luckiest thing in my life to be able to find Master and become Master's disciple in this vast world. Since you know how rare and lucky it is for us to be Master and disciple, you naturally understand that in Master's eyes, all of you are the people closest to Master. Although your second senior brother is Master's son, there is not much difference between how I treat him and how I treat all of you." Luo Fan sighed. "Then, why?" Lei Jiuxiao was stunned when he heard that, but there was still stubbornness in his eyes. After being tempered in the minor thousand world for tens of millions of years, Lei Jiuxiao's heart had already reached a state of near perfection. However, such a perfect state of mind did not mean that he would be at ease and in front of everyone at any time, as if everything was under his control. In reality, the perfection of his heart only allowed him to see through the ways of the world, so he didn't have much doubt in his heart. That was why he could be calm and confident. Even if he was occasionally doubtful and puzzled, he would be able to maintain his calm by suppressing his heart. At this moment there was a strong sense of confusion in his heart, and there was doubt that had been suppressed at the bottom of his heart for tens of thousands of years. Moreover, the person in front of him was his master, the only person he cared about in this world. Naturally, he would not act as carefree as he did in front of others, as if everything was under his control. As a result, he behaved like an ordinary person right now. He didn't hide anything or put on any pretense. This was the truest reaction of his heart. Luo Fan smiled slightly and said, "This is the general trend of the world. Don't tell me you still can't understand it? If I didn't help your second senior brother, how could the disaster of the world be controlled so smoothly? How could the primordial world appear like this after the disaster?" Luo Fan's words were very simple, but they were like a bolt of lightning. They immediately tore through the doubts that had accumulated in Lei Jiuxiao's heart for hundreds of thousands of years. In an instant, countless lights and shadows flashed across his mind, causing him to be drenched in sweat. If second senior brother's strength wasn't equal to mine back then, what form would the disaster of the world have taken? Lei Jiuxiao immediately had an answer to this question. The disaster of the world was not something that could be eliminated by human power. Lei Jiuxiao naturally did not have that kind of tribulation. If Luo Fu's strength had been far weaker than his, he would not have shattered the endless starry sky and caused the stars to fall. His supreme cultivation made him understand that even if he had easily defeated Luo Fu back then, the disaster of the world would still have taken place. Moreover, it might have taken a different form. Perhaps there would have been a sudden split among the demons. Perhaps some race would have suddenly risen out of nowhere. Perhaps the world would have suddenly suffered an impact and collapsed. Lei Jiuxiao's thoughts moved extremely quickly. In that instant, the primordial world had already collapsed thousands of times in his mind. Each time, the process was many times more severe than the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. The possibility of triggering a great tribulation was far more dangerous and difficult to control than the process of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. After all these thoughts flashed through his mind, Lei Jiuxiao finally came to a realization. As cold sweat poured down his face, shame appeared in his eyes. He directly knelt before Luo Fan and said, "I am ashamed. Only now do I understand Master's intentions, Master. I was actually dissatisfied before. I deserve to die 10,000 times for my sins. Master, please punish me." Luo Fan did not stop Lei Jiuxiao from kneeling, so Lei Jiuxiao's mind broke through the remnants of Luo Fan's will and made him kneel on the ground. Luo Fan's cultivation realm was unfathomable. He could see the true feelings of all living beings. As a result, he could tell that Lei Jiuxiao's words came from the bottom of his heart and were not mere pleasantries. He could not help but feel gratified. He smiled and said, "There's no need to punish me. It's only natural for you to have such thoughts. If you want to blame someone, blame me for not explaining things clearly to you earlier." With that, he raised his hand again. Lei Jiuxiao once again stood up uncontrollably without the slightest intention of resisting. "Master, there's no need to comfort me. This matter is of great importance. If I had explained things clearly beforehand, it might have led to unpredictable changes and severe consequences. How could I have explained things clearly? This is my fault. Master, please punish me. Otherwise, I won't feel at ease and won't be able to cultivate in peace," Lei Jiuxiao said with a flushed face. His words were extremely sincere. Luo Fan could clearly sense just how determined his will was. Seeing how determined Lei Jiuxiao was, Luo Fan could not say anything else. He could only sigh and say, "If that's the case, I'll give you a little punishment so that you can calm down." "Thank you, Master." Lei Jiuxiao was overjoyed. After understanding the deeper meaning behind Luo Fan's actions, he no longer doubted Luo Fan's intentions. He believed that Luo Fan was too biased towards his second senior brother and that he had hurt Lei Jiuxiao's feelings. He believed that he had let down his master and that he was not worthy of being his master's disciple. In this case, if Luo Fan didn't punish him and just let him off lightly, or even comforted him with gentle words, he would feel a serious uneasiness in his heart. He would feel that his behavior was really bad, and his mind would be unable to calm down. This was simply fatal for a cultivator. Naturally, he was looking forward to Luo Fan imposing a certain punishment on him and making him pay for his previous thoughts. Only in this way could he reduce his sense of guilt and calm down his mind. Only then would he be able to cultivate in a better place. As a result, Lei Jiuxiao's request for Luo Fan to punish him came from the bottom of his heart. Luo Fan had seen this, which was why he had agreed to punish Lei Jiuxiao. Of course, this was only a punishment in name. Lei Jiuxiao needed this punishment to calm his mind, but it was impossible for Luo Fan to impose punishment on Lei Jiuxiao just because of his misunderstanding. There was a certain degree of control in this. This degree of control might be extremely difficult for others, but for Luo Fan it was extremely easy. He had millions of ways to inflict punishment on Lei Jiuxiao, but in fact it was a form of training for him, allowing him to gain benefits from this punishment and obtain methods to improve himself. At this moment, Luo Fan casually pointed at Lei Jiuxiao and said, "Master will punish you by not using the Son of Heaven's clone for the next 100 generations." With that, a mysterious power descended on Lei Jiuxiao, directly sealing some mysterious existence in him. In a flash, Lei Jiuxiao completely lost the connection he had with the Son of Heaven Feng, the Son of Heaven Lei, and the Son of Heaven Zhurong clones that he had painstakingly cultivated. It was as if he had never cultivated the 3 clones in the first place. For Lei Jiuxiao, such a punishment was equivalent to crippling a large portion of his battle strength. It was extremely heavy. However, Lei Jiuxiao did not complain at all. Instead, he breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Thank you for fulfilling my wish, Master." Chapter 711. The three clones were extremely important to Lei Jiuxiao. It was almost the summary of Lei Jiuxiao's achievements after he broke away from the various methods taught by Luo Fan. First text. Its power might be nothing to Luo Fan, but to Lei Jiuxiao, it was not only the supreme magical power for him to overcome the tribulation and destroy demons, but it was also what he relied on to achieve his own Tao in the future. Under such circumstances, the three clones were sealed by Luo Fan. To Lei Jiuxiao, this punishment was extremely severe. It was almost related to whether he could have his own Tao in the future. However, even so, Lei Jiuxiao was completely relaxed at this moment. His mind became extremely clear. He bowed to Luo Fan and left. Luo Fan smiled and said, Go. This is a rare opportunity. Don't waste it." Lei Jiuxiao bowed, turned into a long rainbow, and left in the direction his intuition pointed him to. Although the might of these three clones is ordinary, they contain a deep level of profundity. It's a seed of the Grand Tao. With your current cultivation realm, it's impossible for you to comprehend that profundity. If you continue to use it, you'll instead be in complete darkness. When you possess the cultivation realm to comprehend that profundity, you'll instead be unable to comprehend it. After 100 yuan, you might have the cultivation realm to comprehend that mystery. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. He naturally did not seal Lei Jiuxiao's three clones to punish Lei Jiuxiao. Instead, he realized that the three clones had the potential to become Lei Jiuxiao's own Tao. They were the seeds of a Tao. Therefore, he used the opportunity of punishment to help Lei Jiuxiao nourish and strengthen that Tao. In order to let Lei Jiuxiao grow to the level of Hongjun, he could break away from the Tao he taught and find a Tao that was suitable for him. Compared to before, Lei Jiuxiao and the others were kept in the heaven and earth in the sleeve by Luo Fan, the primordial world had undergone a tremendous change. Apart from a very small number of traces, they almost thought that this was a completely different world. When Lei Jiuxiao and the others met Luo Fan, they weren't in the mood to pay attention to the surroundings. They only knew that Luo Fan was in front of them. However, after they left Luo Fan, they couldn't help but be shocked by the mysterious and indescribable primordial world that was completely different from what they'd seen in the past. He only felt that everything in front of him was so mysterious, so novel. The few of them were all extremely profound in terms of cultivation, and with the various kinds of exquisite and indescribable flying techniques passed down by Luo Fan, the speed of their flying naturally did not need to be described. Several days later, the 6 of them, including Lei Jiuxiao, arrived at their respective destinations. Some of these places were located on one of the 1,296 continents in the Great Desolate Land. Some of them were located in the void, the boundary between the Great Desolate Land and the Starry Sky. Some of them were located in the boundless Starry Sky, and some of them were located in the boundless ocean. However, no matter where they were, that location would definitely faintly give off an aura that was compatible with them. It would give off a will that could impact their minds and shake their souls. That was why it would guide their instincts and lead them there. Several days had passed since they'd spent traveling. Lei Jiuxiao and the others naturally wouldn't waste any more time. Instead, they activated the technique that Luo Fan had passed down to them at their destination without any hesitation. The technique was extremely profound, and the intricacies within it almost surpassed all the cultivation techniques they'd seen in the past. Fortunately, the technique was of the same lineage as the Wei fruit. Even Zhong Luan, Tian Yi, and Lu Xia seemed to have seen the technique before. As a result, it was not difficult for them to cultivate the technique. As a result, even Zhong Luan and the others only spent a few hours to circulate the technique. They could vaguely sense a wondrous existence that was even deeper, vaster, and more profound than the laws of the universe. It was the mysterious existence that controlled the great tribulation of the world in a state of boundless chaos. The mysteriousness of the existence had reached an unimaginable level. Even with the more complicated and intricate techniques that Luo Fan used, he could only activate a sliver of it. The techniques that they used were many times simpler and cruder than Luo Fan's. Naturally, they could only activate a sliver of what Luo Fan had done. In other words, it was just a sliver of the vast existence. It was almost insignificant and could be completely ignored. Among them, Lei Jiuxiao was already at the peak of the golden immortal realm. He was only a thin membrane away from attaining the Tai Dao fruit. It seemed like he could attain the Tai Dao fruit with just a gentle poke. He was the most powerful person among them. Gu Ling, Lin Tiannan, and the others below him might not be as powerful as Lei Jiuxiao, but they were still at the golden immortal realm. However, Gu Ling and Lin Tiannan cultivated the Wei fruit, so they were thousands of times more powerful than Zhong Luan, Tianyi, and Lu Xia, who did not cultivate the Wei fruit. With this level of cultivation, they already stood at the peak of the entire untainted world. However, at this moment, in front of this mysterious existence, they were even more insignificant than ants. This made them suddenly feel how insignificant they were and how long the path ahead of them was. Just this feeling alone made their state of mind improve greatly. It calmed down the restlessness caused by their status at the peak of the untainted world that had occupied it for tens of thousands of years. This clear feeling made them feel that they had gained a lot. They even felt that just the appearance of this feeling without any benefits was enough to make them satisfied and even inexplicably pleasantly surprised. However, the method that Luo Fan taught them naturally could not only have this little benefit. When they sensed the vast and mysterious existence, they vaguely sensed that there seemed to be some inconceivable thing flowing through their bodies through some incomprehensible and unimaginable channel, leaving something on their bodies that they could not detect at all. It was something that did not exist in the first place. Although they could not feel this kind of remnant, they understood that the existence of this remnant would be the second most important opportunity in their lives. The most important opportunity was naturally meeting their master and teacher. When the remnant appeared, they all entered a mysterious and indescribable realm. Although it was also indescribable, the realm that everyone entered was unique and completely different from the others. It was a realm that was the most beneficial to each of them. In that realm, they had a deeper understanding of themselves, the outside world, the untainted world, and everything they had experienced in the past. They felt that they had suddenly gained a vision and perspective that far exceeded their own realm. They could observe everything from a more advanced and mysterious angle. This sort of perspective was naturally extremely beneficial to them. Not only was it able to allow them to comprehend the changes in the outside world with even more acute senses, it even allowed them to gain a deeper understanding of their experiences in the past, and it allowed them to obtain a clearer understanding of the path they should take towards the Tao. Under this change, the six of them completely lost their sense of time. All of their minds were immersed in that perception. They tried their best to comprehend the various changes, and their cultivation realm also slowly increased at an undetectable rate. Luo Fan stood where Buzhou Mountain used to be. His gaze passed through endless space and time and directly saw their performance. He could not help but feel very satisfied. Although their performance did not surprise him, it did not disappoint him. They did not reach their peak with the help of the mysterious existence, but they had roughly unleashed its power. According to their current performance, once the mysterious existence left the primordial world, their cultivation realm would definitely improve tremendously. Even Lei Jiuxiao probably had a 10 to 20% chance of breaking through the earthly immortal Tao fruit and attaining the primordial unity Tao fruit. It should be known that although he was currently at the peak of the golden immortal realm and seemed to be only a thin layer away from the primordial unity Tao fruit, the difficulty of breaking through this thin layer was even more difficult than cultivating from an ordinary person to his current realm. Now that he had a 10 to 20% chance of breaking through, it was already an astonishing improvement. Seeing that they were on the right track, Luo Fan no longer paid attention to them. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he was already 300,000 kilometers above the ground. Looking down, he saw that the edge of the continent below had already faintly appeared in the distance. This continent was not considered large among the 1,296 continents in the untainted world, but it was still trillions of kilometers in circumference. 300,000 kilometers above the ground seemed extremely far, but compared to the size of the continent it was nothing. To be able to see the edge of the continent from such a distance, Luo Fan's vision was already unimaginably powerful. Naturally, Luo Fan did not come here just to test how powerful his vision was. He came here because the continent was undergoing an inexplicable change. This change was the only way for the untainted world to become complete and stable. It was not something that Luo Fan could stop, and Luo Fan did not have the intention to stop it. When Luo Fan was 300,000 miles above the ground, the incomparably huge and sturdy continent that was filled with extremely dense yuan qi suddenly trembled. This trembling was not an earthquake, but the continent, the space above it, and everything within it. As it trembled, an illusory feeling spread from the continent. It was as if the entire continent was gradually becoming illusory and becoming invisible. The change was so shocking and unbelievable that even Luo Fan narrowed his eyes slightly. He tried his best to find the source of the change. So it's here. The circulation and changes of the universe are indeed indescribably exquisite. A thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. When the thought disappeared, the boundless continent below him, which even Luo Fan could only vaguely see with his eyesight above 300,000 kilometers, had already disappeared without a trace. It was replaced by a boundless sea, as if the continent had never existed in the first place. The change was unimaginably fast. In the blink of an eye, the world changed and the continent disappeared. In the eyes of others, this kind of change might be incomprehensible, and they might even wonder if they were dreaming. However, before the change was completed, Luo Fan had already seen through the root of this change, and knew the reason and specific process of this change. It was naturally impossible for the continent to disappear into thin air. It could even be said that at this moment the continent still existed. It was still as sturdy as before, and it still had dense vitality. It still vaguely had an extremely mysterious and close connection with the supreme great Tao of the primordial world and the 1,295 continents. In reality, the continent seemed to have disappeared, but in reality, it was only hidden in a deeper space-time. It was a space-time where the flow of time was extremely chaotic compared to the primordial world, but it was extremely compatible with the continent, allowing the continent to exist in a more stable space-time and obtain greater strength. This change was very similar to the special rhythm of the flow of time brought about by the saint's body. However, it was even deeper because even space had its own special rhythm. It was this special, wonderful, and completely different rhythm from the outside world that made it difficult to see the continent, even though it still existed in the primordial world and its position had not changed at all. It was as if it did not exist at all. Even if there were living beings who could find the original location of the continent, they would only feel that it was a sea, and they would not be able to discover the existence of the continent. The reason for this was very simple. This was because all living beings in the primordial world were in a completely different space-time from this continent. In other words, that continent was in a completely different space-time from the primordial world and all living beings in the primordial world. It was extremely independent and independent. That form of existence was not necessarily stronger than the form of existence of a saint, but it was even more unbelievable. It was also more beneficial to the continent. In this form of existence, the continent could isolate all negative influences from the outside world. It could develop and grow in the best and most comfortable way until it reached the peak. The reason why there was such a mysterious change was because of the uniqueness of the continent. This continent was where Buzhou Mountain had originally stood. It was also where Pangu had stood after creating the world. Since the existence of the primordial world, it had supported Buzhou Mountain and the entire world. It could be said that it was the hub of the entire world. In this great tribulation of the world, this continent had endured the impact of billions of stars falling from the sky, causing billions of stars to collapse and be destroyed. To those stars, this continent was their destroyer. It was the culprit that caused their collapse and destruction. However, to this continent, those stars were the most selfless contributors. They contributed their power and their bodies to continuously refine this continent. They continuously used another method to refine this continent. This kind of refinement constantly tested the sturdiness of this continent. At the same time, it also made this continent more and more mysterious and incredible. In the end, after the great tribulation of the world, this continent finally possessed incredible power and truly became the core hub of the entire primordial world. This kind of change made the essence of this continent different from any matter in the primordial world. It became extraordinary and holy, thus possessing the strange characteristics of a saint. It used the essence of its own existence to change the rhythm of time and space in its position, making the whole world and the supreme great Tao submit to it. The reason why this characteristic erupted at this moment was that the changes in the entire primordial world were still intense. The space-time of the primordial world was still under the absolute rule of that mysterious existence, and it could not submit to this continent. It was only when the mysterious existence relaxed its rule over the space-time of the primordial world during the process of retreating that the space-time of the primordial world submitted to the continent, resulting in this mysterious scene. After understanding these mysteries, Luo Fan suddenly understood something. When the essence of one's existence rises to a certain level, it can affect the space-time of the outside world and make the space-time of the outside world submit to one's own body. So this is not just the privilege of a saint, nor is it the privilege of a cultivator. Instead, it's a power that all artifacts can possess. This thought flashed through his mind. In a flash, he finally understood why he still could not obtain true freedom even though he had completely cut off all connections with the primordial world. He still needed to rely on the primordial world to survive. Perhaps I can't truly obtain freedom because I can't raise the essence of my existence to the level where I can affect the space-time rhythm of the outside world. Thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he came to a conclusion in the blink of an eye. However, although he had already obtained this conclusion, which he did not know if it was true or false, Luo Fan could not think of anything else. To make the essence of one's existence so strong that it could make one's own space-time rhythm yield to the space-time of the outside world, there was no shortcut other than continuously increasing one's cultivation realm. Even if it was like the Jili child, who could obtain this kind of power with the help of some kind of divine ability, he would need to constantly consume endless power to maintain it. It was only a divine ability. Even the power obtained through this method was extremely weak and could be easily broken. It could not be considered freedom at all. Naturally, it could not be considered freedom. Understanding this, Luo Fan felt that another door had opened in front of him. He suddenly had another goal to work hard for. #Free download of ebooks. Chapter 712. By continuously improving the essence of one's existence, one would be able to strongly influence the rhythm of time and space around them, thereby making the space-time of the outside world bend to one's own rhythm. This would allow one to completely transcend the shackles of the outside world, truly achieve complete self, and truly have the prerequisite of being able to survive freely in the state of chaos. First written, it was not difficult to come to this conclusion. After all, in the state of chaos, time, space, matter, energy, and everything else were in an extremely chaotic state. There was no heaven, earth, and space-time that could support the existence of living beings. Under such circumstances, if living beings wanted to survive, they naturally had to create their own space-time and form their own world. If one's existence could not even affect the space-time of the outside world, and could not make the existence of the outside world bend to one's own form of existence, how could one not be affected in the state of chaos? How could one maintain one's physical existence in it? In the past, Luo Fan only knew that in order to truly survive in the state of chaos, one must obtain the primordial Tao fruit and become a sage. However, he had no idea how to obtain the primordial Tao fruit and why it could exist freely in the state of chaos. In other words, he could not understand the form of existence of the primordial Tao fruit or sage-level existences for 100 years, and what kind of incredible magic they had. At this moment, after this enlightenment, another door opened in front of him. The primordial Tao fruit and sage-level existences were still unfathomable to him, and they were still powerful beyond all his imagination. However, he could already vaguely see some traces of them. At the very least, he knew one of the reasons why saint-level existences could exist freely in the state of chaos. Although this reason might be insignificant compared to the true reason why saint-level existences could exist freely in the state of chaos, it was already an unimaginable improvement compared to the time when he couldn't understand or see through it at all. This was enough for Luo Fan to be proud for a long time. With a slight thought, the magic power in Luo Fan's body moved slightly. This movement was extremely mysterious and wonderful. It caused his entire body to undergo an incomparably wonderful change. In this change, Luo Fan's form of existence underwent a strange change. Amidst the changes, the time and space around Luo Fan's body underwent a miraculous change. The rhythm of space and time gradually approached the rhythm of his own existence, and gradually separated from the normal rhythm of space and time in the primordial world. As the world changed, Luo Fan's figure gradually disappeared, just like the continent below. It was as if he had never appeared, as if he had never existed in the primordial world. This kind of change was so wonderful, so strange, but it also made people feel that it was so natural, as if Luo Fan had never existed in this world. At this moment, Luo Fan had fallen into an incomparably wonderful state. This kind of wonderful state was not completely perfect. Instead, it was an extremely complicated realm that contained endless freedom, loneliness, darkness, and desolation. This feeling was so complicated that it made Luo Fan's unshakable Tao heart fluctuate. What he had used previously was some of the essence techniques he had extracted from the Jili heavenly scripture. It was a technique that allowed the Jili child to use his three-headed and six-armed body to give his body the characteristics of a sage's body after becoming an itinerant immortal. It allowed him to bend the rhythm of time around him. This essence was hidden very deeply. If it was any other living being, even if they cultivated the ninely heaven scripture to its peak, even if they cultivated it to perfection, or even if they cultivated it to the level of a sage, they would definitely not be able to extract this essence. However, Luo Fan was different. It wasn't only because Luo Fan was already at the zenith heaven truth Tao realm, but also because the Nine Dawn Heaven scripture was organized by him according to the profundities contained in the sage's body. It was a mysterious technique that was completely formed from his thoughts. It was precisely because this technique was completely sorted out by him that he was able to have a deeper understanding and a stronger comprehension towards the Jili heavenly scripture than those who had cultivated this technique to perfection. As long as he had some guidance, he would naturally be able to understand the essence of this profound technique and know what sort of profound technique could allow this technique to possess a certain profound power. Therefore, he was able to instantly extract the essence of the technique that allowed him to possess the body of a saint and change the surrounding spacetime, making the surrounding time and space submit to him. Thus, with the help of this essence of the technique, he could also possess that kind of mysterious power. Even though this technique was extremely profound, it was only a technique after all. It couldn't truly raise the essence of Luo Fan's existence to the level of a sage. Therefore, if one wanted to use this technique, the amount of spiritual energy needed had reached an unimaginable level. Even with the infinite energy units produced by Luo Fan's Sea of Consciousness and the huge amount of energy units produced by the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit, they could not keep up with the speed of consumption of energy. In other words, in this state, the energy in Luo Fan's body would only be continuously consumed. It would not be able to achieve a balance between consumption and replenishment. As a result, he was like the Jili child. It was impossible for him to remain in this state forever. Of course, his magic power was hundreds of millions of times deeper than Jili child's. It was naturally extremely difficult for him to completely exhaust his magic power in this situation where he was constantly replenishing his magic power. As a result, the amount of time he could stay in this state was tens of thousands of times longer than the Jili child. The Jili child could only stay in the spacetime for less than 15 minutes, but Luo Fan could stay in the primordial world for dozens of yuanhui. However, if he stayed for dozens of yuanhui, the damage to him would be far greater than the damage suffered by the Jili child. After all, his magic power was replenished by the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit and the Dharma power units produced in his Sea of Consciousness. If such magic power was exhausted as well, it naturally meant that his Tao fruit of the Great Firmament and his Sea of Consciousness had suffered irreparable damage, and it had reached a state where he could no longer produce magic power units to replenish his magic power. How could the Jili child, who had only exhausted his magic power, compare to such a consumption? With this premise, no matter how wonderful this state was, Luo Fan would not stay in this state for too long. Moreover, to the Jili child, this state allowed him to transcend all restraints and obtain supreme freedom. However, to him, the situation was countless times more complicated. After all, the Jili child was just a Dharma treasure. Although it was a living Dharma treasure that Luo Fan had refined through various unbelievable methods, its spiritual consciousness was no different from a real living being. However, it was a Dharma treasure after all. It was a Dharma treasure that carried the Jili heavenly scripture and all the power of the saint's body. To him, as long as his body existed, all his cultivation would not be a problem. The wonderful power in the mysterious spacetime deep in his body could completely give him everything he needed. Therefore, the various negative emotions brought to him by transcending the shackles of time and space in the outside world and allowing himself to be in his own rhythm of time and space did not affect his spirit at all. All he felt was supreme freedom, the ease and joy of transcending all shackles. However, the situation was completely different for Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan's cultivation realm was billions of times higher than that of the Jili child, there was still a huge gap between him and the saint level. Under such circumstances, his knowledge, eyesight, perception, magic power, and everything else were millions and millions of times worse than that of a sage. Just like that, although he had entered the state that only a saint could have, where he completely transcended all the restraints of the outside spacetime and was completely in his own spacetime rhythm, he also suffered the various negative effects of this state. It was because of these negative effects that Luo Fan felt so complicated and conflicted. He was in a completely independent spacetime rhythm that had transcended the restraints of the outside world. Although it was unprecedented for him to break away from the shackles of the outside world, at the same time, he had completely lost everything. In this state, everything in the outside world had turned into nothingness to him. In the entire world, in the endless spacetime, he was the only one who existed. Everything in the world, including the universe, no longer existed to him. His supreme perception that could almost sense the entire primordial world was no longer effective. He was completely cut off from sensing the outside world. He could only sense the spacetime he was in, which was his own existence. He could only see his own existence. Everything in the outside world was just darkness and nothingness to him. To him, these were still bearable and could be overcome. What was even more difficult for him to overcome was that his past, present, and future seemed to overlap at this moment, causing him to be in an incomparably marvelous and bizarre state. In this state, he seemed to be his past, his present, and his future. However, at the same time, he seemed to be a strange existence with no past, no present, and no future. It was natural to have such a strange form of existence. Every living being, every substance, and even every energy was a unique existence in the endless world. They all had a space-time rhythm that was completely different from any other living being, substance, and energy. Some of these space-time rhythms were fast and slow, some were twisted and spiraled, some were spinning, and some were even straight and reversed. They were all strange and different. This space-time rhythm was not unchanging. Instead, it would change as living beings, substances, and energy improved and evolved. These changes were not necessarily towards a certain rhythm, but towards the rhythm of perfecting oneself to the greatest extent and allowing oneself to achieve the greatest degree of perfection. To Luo Fan, although the essence of his existence could not be as strong as a saint, who could directly distort the outside world's space-time and make it bend to him, he had already reached a certain level of power. Under such circumstances, his space-time rhythm would naturally be closer to the rhythm of perfection than Julie Child. In other words, because Luo Fan's cultivation realm was higher, his space-time rhythm became more intense and profound than Julie Child's space-time rhythm. Luo Fan's goal of cultivation was to eventually form his own great Tao. His space-time rhythm would naturally evolve in this direction. In order to achieve the great Tao, one naturally had to unify one's past, present, and future, reaching a state of perfection in terms of time, space, matter, and energy. As a result, it could be imagined that Luo Fan's space-time rhythm definitely contained all kinds of imaginable changes. It was inevitable for it to be fast and slow, straight and reversed. It was precisely because of this that when Luo Fan used the power of his divine ability to bend the time and space of the outside world to his own rhythm of time and space, allowing himself to gradually approach perfection, approaching the rhythm of time and space of his own Tao, it was equivalent to superimposing the countless selves of the past and future, forming a unified body. To Luo Fan, who would attain primordial chaos Tao fruit in the future, this might be an extremely perfect and perfect form of existence. However, for the current Luo Fan, this strange form of existence had already exceeded the limit of what he could bear. At that moment, he only felt billions of different emotions. Different emotions appeared in his mind at the same time, causing him to be at a loss and unable to face them. If not for the fact that these billions of emotions had the same freedom and the same self, he would have probably been driven crazy by this strange change. After an unknown period of time, it seemed like billions of years had passed, but it also seemed like it was just an instant. Luo Fan finally found his present with his outstanding willpower. He controlled the Dharma power in his body and suddenly calmed down, allowing the surrounding space-time rhythm to recover and return to the space-time rhythm of the primordial world. His figure also appeared in the primordial world. The entire process was extremely natural. It was like a shadow materializing from the void, causing no one to feel any abruptness. After his figure reappeared, Luo Fan was already covered in sweat. His face was slightly pale, and there was regret and joy in his expression. What he regretted was that he had returned to the boundless space-time and could not be at ease. Fortunately, he was able to escape from the state that his body still couldn't bear and was able to recover. These two feelings were extremely strong. They had already surpassed the limits that his mind could suppress. That was why they appeared, causing his body to show such a different change. It also made him sweat cold sweat that he had not shed for countless years. It's a pity that this technique is only used by me in the Daluo Truth Tao. The future that I can combine is only the future of the Daluo Truth Tao level. Otherwise, I can use the future cultivation realm to increase my current cultivation realm. Luo Fan's mind was extremely tough after all. He recovered in the blink of an eye. Instead, he began to think about how to use the state where the past, present, and future were unified. As the thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's figure and face returned to normal. At this moment, he understood better than anyone else that with his current cultivation realm, he could not endure that wondrous state at all. Before he obtained a breakthrough in his cultivation realm, he could not use that technique again. Otherwise, the gains would not make up for the losses. He was able to find the present from that strange form of existence this time, but he might not be so lucky next time. If he was not careful and allowed his future to dominate the present, there would be unpredictable consequences. After making up his mind, Luo Fan finally calmed down completely. With a flash of thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure directly crossed the distance of 300,000 kilometers and arrived at the original location of the continent. It was where Mount Buzhou used to be, but now it was just above a boundless sea. He floated above the sea, several hundred meters above the ground. His eyes flashed with strange light. It seemed to be the light of wisdom, but also the light of boundless will. After a long while, the time and space around him began to ripple slightly. After that, his figure gradually turned ethereal, and he'd completely vanished after a few breaths of time. It was as if he'd never appeared in the first place. At this moment, Luo Fan had already entered another space-time rhythm. He had directly stepped into the continent that had used his powerful existence essence to affect the space-time rhythm of the outside world, and was thus hidden in the invisible. The place where he was standing was in a valley on this continent, which was also the spot that had endured the impact of the countless falling stars. Clearly, Luo Fan had used his supreme divine ability to change the space-time rhythm around him to the same rhythm as that of the continent. Thus, he crossed the barrier of space-time and stepped into the continent again. During this process, Luo Fan did not use the essence of the technique that allowed him to bend the rhythm of the surrounding space-time to match his own. What he used was only the various powers that changed the space-time of the primordial world after he became a zenith heaven. What he changed was not his own space-time rhythm. Instead, he used a great divine ability to separate the space-time around him from the primordial world. He froze this space-time and changed its rhythm, thus making this space-time and the continent's space-time rhythm, thus entering the continent. At this moment, when he looked at the continent, it was still different from before. Instead, it seemed to be separated by a piece of glass. Although it seemed extremely clear, no matter what he looked at, he felt like he could not touch it. The reason for this was that he did not look at the continent with his own eyes. Instead, he looked at it with his will that was frozen on the thin space-time around him. Q. Chapter 713. It was precisely because he could not see it with his own eyes that Luo Fan felt like he was separated from his surroundings by an invisible barrier. Text first. This was also the only way for Luo Fan to see the continent at this moment. After all, the rhythm of time and space he was in was completely different from the rhythm of time and space of this continent. Unless he temporarily gave up on his rhythm of time and space and let his rhythm of time and space completely assimilate with this continent, he would definitely not be able to see or touch any matter in this continent with his own eyes. For Luo Fan, if it was not necessary, would he willingly give up on his rhythm of time and space? Naturally, this was the only way he could use this method to sense the various things in this continent. Observing this continent from this angle, Luo Fan had a different kind of comprehension. After comprehending for a while, he waved his hand, and countless cities flew out of his sleeve. They grew as the wind blew, and in the blink of an eye, they passed through the barriers of time and space and landed in various places on the continent. They occupied most of the hubs of the continent's vitality and received the continent's boundless vitality, causing the cities to constantly undergo all kinds of unbelievable transformations and give birth to all kinds of unbelievable improvements. The rhythm of time and space of this continent was completely different from the outside world, and it was also completely different from the cities and the countless living beings in them. Under such circumstances, when the living beings in the cities entered the continent and were affected by the continent's unique rhythm of time and space, they naturally could not stay awake like Luo Fan. Instead, they were completely lost, as if they had fallen into a long, blurry dream that they could never wake up from. Among these living beings, Buzhou Mountain's god, who was already considered extremely powerful innate gods, was much better than the other living beings. He could barely maintain a bit of consciousness, but he had also lost his own rhythm of time and space. He could only think that he was in some kind of abnormal state, but he could not clearly understand what kind of abnormal state he was in, let alone know how much time had passed or where he was. Although this wonderful state made these living beings unable to control themselves and lost in the rhythm of time and space of this continent, it was also extremely beneficial to these living beings. First of all, in this state, the rhythm of time and space of this continent could unknowingly affect the rhythm of time and space of these living beings, causing them to gradually move closer to this continent. This could allow these living beings to continuously be tempered by the strong essence of existence of this continent, so that their essence of existence could also continuously strengthen. This kind of strengthening might only be slight, but it was extremely rare. However, it was extremely rare. It was almost like helping them cultivate in another way. Moreover, because they were affected by the rhythm of time and space of this continent and were lost, the many living beings would not be affected by the outside world, regardless of their spirit or lifespan. Instead, they could exist forever. They would only return to their original state when this continent spat them out one day and left this continent. This continent was extremely closely related to the entire primordial world. It was extremely mysterious. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for it to maintain this rhythm of time and space independent of the primordial world forever. It would definitely lose this state after a period of time under the circulation of the primordial world. It would merge with the primordial world again and become a spacetime again. At that time, it would naturally be the time for these cities to leave this continent. In fact, the process of leaving this continent did not even need Luo Fan's control. As long as the continent's spacetime was synchronized with the primordial world again, there would naturally be a repulsive force that would send these cities out of the continent and to a certain place in the primordial world. And those places would definitely correspond to a certain vitality hub on this continent. It was most likely to be in one of the 1,295 continents in the primordial world. How many benefits you can obtain, where you can reach, and when you can leave this state will depend on your luck. It's very literary. Luo Fan sighed. With a thought, the spacetime rhythm around him returned to the normal spacetime rhythm of the primordial world. As soon as it recovered, the continent gradually became illusory again in his eyes. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. However, his figure reappeared in the sea and floated thousands of feet above the surface of the sea. Before the great tribulation of heaven and earth this time, he put many living beings and the cities of the human and demon clans into his sleeve. It was only because he could protect these cities and living beings. He did not have any intention to control everything about these living beings. Therefore, although he had many ways to arrange the lives of these living beings and even put them into the Void Wuji Palace, which could also bring him more benefits, he did not do so. Instead, he directly placed these living beings in the continent that was the core hub of the primordial world. He let this continent and the natural circulation of the primordial world determine the fate of these living beings and their positions. After doing all this, Luo Fan raised his head and looked up at the starry sky. His eyes pierced through the infinite space-time and directly saw the bright realm behind the sun and moon. At this moment, the bright realm had completed the process of evolving from a minor chiliocosm to a medium-class world. It had become a real, incomparably complete medium-class world. The vastness of this medium-class world was not much different from before, but its depth, stability, and purity of primordial qi were more than 10 times stronger than before. As Luo Fu and the others integrated with the bright realm, they experienced the changes as if they were experiencing it themselves. The benefits they gained were extremely great. At this time, there was an indescribably powerful force brewing in the bright realm. The nature of this force was extremely mysterious. It vaguely contained an existence that the earthly immortals' Tao fruit could not have: primordial unity. Apparently, there were living beings breaking through the earthly immortals' Tao fruit and becoming primordial unity. That's good. Seeing this, Luo Fan was finally completely relieved. A thought flashed through his mind, and he withdrew his gaze. As soon as he felt the aura, he knew that at this moment, Luo Fu had finally broken through to the golden immortal realm and was attaining the primordial unity Tao fruit. Luo Fu had been suppressing this process for a long time. At this time, he had finally completely released it. Naturally, when the conditions were right, success came naturally. There was not the slightest obstruction. There was no need for Luo Fan to worry, so he naturally did not waste time continuing to pay attention to it. If Luo Fu's breakthrough went smoothly, then he would be able to handle the changes of Guangpu, Luo Chunyang, and Luo Guo perfectly, so he did not need to worry. After this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan raised his hand and casually pointed. An invisible and wondrous spiritual light was emitted from his hand, passing through the endless void and sinking into a certain part of the sea that was billions of miles away from where he was. It kept going deeper and deeper until it reached the deepest part of the sea, sinking into a certain black shadow, causing that black shadow to suddenly become illusory and real at the same time, real and fake at the same time. The black shadow was none other than Hong Jun, who had exhausted all his mana and mind when he was mending the sky. At this moment, Hongjuan's expression was serene. The mana in his body slowly flowed and accumulated. His mind and mind seemed to be there and not there, but he was immersed in some extremely mysterious and magical realm. In this realm, the mind and mana in Hongjuan's body could recover at a speed that was tens of thousands of times faster than normal. In the process, his mind could also be refined endlessly, so that its nature and power could be constantly enhanced. This change not only allowed Hongjun to return to his peak state when he woke up, but it could also allow him to constantly stabilize his primordial unity scattered number during this process. Perhaps it could not allow him to directly reach the peak of primordial unity scattered number after he woke up, but at least it could allow him to leave the state of primordial unity scattered number. And this state of primordial unity scattered number, under normal circumstances, would require at least 1,000,000 years to cross. The spiritual light emitted by Luo Fan did not contain any power, but it could affect the spacetime around Hongjun, forming some kind of wonderful spacetime fault. Outside Hongjuan's body, a thin film with an abnormal rhythm of spacetime formed, separating Hongjun from the untainted world, thus isolating all possible effects on Hongjuan's state. This thin film seemed to have almost no thickness, and it was only a thin film that slightly distorted the rhythm of spacetime, but in fact it was unimaginably strong. If he could not understand the mystery of spacetime rhythm, he could only use the supreme power of breaking spacetime to break this thin film, and only then could he affect Hongjun, who was protected by this thin film. And for the untainted world, which had already been unbelievably improved at this time, to affect the void, even the golden immortal realm was a little difficult. As for breaking spacetime to a higher level, perhaps even the cultivators who had achieved Tai Dao fruit might not be able to do it. Therefore, it could be said that with this thin layer of protection, Hongjun was already considered absolutely safe. After doing all this, Luo Fan let out a long breath. With a thought, he took a step forward, and his figure disappeared between the untainted world. This process did not cause any fluctuations of time and space, as if he was just a phantom, and at this moment, he suddenly disappeared. At this time, Luo Fan had directly crossed space-time and appeared on the wonderful platform of the Wuji Palace in the void. As soon as he set foot on this platform, an endless stream of light flowed through his mind, making him feel as if his inspiration was like a landslide or a tsunami. It was as if at every moment, everything he saw, every feeling he felt, and every experience he had in his memories could give him endless strange ideas, allowing him to discover the profound truths hidden behind them. The flow of time in the Wuji Palace was not the same as that of the untainted world. Among them, the flow of time in the boundless world was 365 times faster than that of the untainted world. The flow of time in the medium world was 365 times faster than that of the boundless world, which was 133,325 times faster than that of the untainted world. The flow of time in the small kiliacosm was also 365 times faster than that of the medium world, which was more than 48,627,125 times faster than that of the untainted world. The time in the small kiliacosm was also 365 times faster than that of the medium world, which was more than 48,627,125 times faster. Compared to the small kiliacosm inside the Wuji Palace, trillions of years had passed. Even for the medium world, billions of years had passed. For the great kiliacosm, the time that had passed was the shortest, but it was still tens of millions of years. In this case, it could be imagined how great the changes in the Wuji Palace would be compared to when he left. Trillions of years were just a number, but for a world, for an entire civilization, it was an unimaginably long period of time, enough to produce all kinds of unimaginable changes. During this long period of time, almost all the small kiliacosms in the three-level world system had been destroyed. It was only because of the flow of power in the three-level world system that they were reborn and evolved after being destroyed. This special effect was not controlled by Luo Fan, but formed by the natural flow of the three-level world system. This was also one of the manifestations of the infinite vitality of the world system. In the past, in the Wuji Palace, the time that the small kiliacosm had experienced was definitely not shorter than the time of trillions of years, but there was no situation where the small kiliacosm was destroyed and reborn. At this time, the world system was complete, but this situation occurred. This was not because the structure of the world in the past was more perfect, but on the contrary, it only meant that the structure of the world in the past had no vitality, and was not a truly perfect structure. The reason for this was because true perfection had to be active and continuous. It didn't have to be able to continuously improve during this process, but at the very least, it had to maintain its vitality and not let it turn into a pool of stagnant water in the end. The structure of the world in the past was like a lake. How it was when it was first created would be how it would be in the future. Even if there were changes, it was only because of the changes created by the creatures in it. This kind of world was actually extremely fragile. This kind of fragility made it difficult for these worlds to be reborn once they were destroyed. The reason why the situation of destruction did not occur after such a long time was that during such a long time, Luo Fan's power had been permeated in the Wuji Palace, unknowingly helping the Wuji Palace to suppress these worlds, so that these worlds would not be destroyed because of the passage of time. Nor would it completely lose vitality because of the existence of a pool of stagnant water, causing the creatures in it to become extinct. It could be said that the reason why the previous worlds were not destroyed was not because of the world itself, but because of Luo Fan's remarkable ability and infinite power. But at this time, the structure of this three-layered world system was completely different. There were more than 9 million worlds in this three-layered world system, and each of them had some kind of mysterious connection with any other world. all the worlds combined together to form an incomparably perfect and incomparably mysterious formation, so that the power of each world was mobilized, constantly moving and operating between the three-layered world system, thus becoming incomparably active and incomparably flexible. Because of this, these worlds no longer needed to reject the suppression of Luo Fan's power, nor did they need to reject the suppression of the Du Tian chaotic divine thunder. They only needed the interaction between the worlds to achieve complete stability. Without the suppression of Luo Fan's power and the suppression of the Du Tian chaotic divine thunder, once those worlds lost vitality or when the power they endured exceeded their own endurance, they would naturally collapse and be transformed into the world's origin. With the help of the power of other worlds, they would evolve and be reborn, forming a new world, forming a cycle of birth and death. This cycle could not only reshuffle the world, but also allow the world itself to undergo some kind of evolution, allowing its endurance to obtain some subtle improvement. This could also be said to be a kind of world evolution. In the trillions of years since Luo Fan left the Wuji Palace, almost every minor kiliocosm had been destroyed and reborn more than once. Among them, the 3,000 minor kiliocosms that Luo Fan had first created had the most number of times of being destroyed and reborn. Even the medium-class world that he had first created was on the verge of being destroyed. Among the 3,000 minor kiliocosms, the one that Luo Fan had first created had the most number of times of being destroyed and reborn. It was the first minor kiliocosm of the Wuji Palace, a minor kiliocosm that had existed for trillions of years before its reincarnation was perfected. The reason for such changes was that these worlds had existed for too long. In the past, because of the existence of Luo Fan's power and the existence of the Thunder Sea, there had been too many factors that could lead to the destruction of these worlds. As long as the triggering force was tens of thousands of times greater than that of other newborn worlds, these worlds could be destroyed. Of course, for these worlds there was no difference between the destruction of other worlds and the destruction of other worlds. These worlds could be improved and evolved after being reborn. To some extent, this was also a process of venting the various negative factors that had been suppressed in the past. However, after all, there were too many negative factors that had been suppressed. In the trillions of years, the oldest minor kiliocosm had been destroyed and reborn nearly 10,000 times. It was almost every 5 or 6 billion years, it would be destroyed and reborn once. The density of this kind of destruction and rebirth was hundreds of times greater than that of other newborn worlds. But at the same time, this high density of destruction and rebirth had also allowed this minor kiliocosm to obtain benefits that were far greater than that of other worlds. Not only had it gradually vented all kinds of negative factors that had been accumulated in the past, but it had also condensed the richest spiritual vigor in the entire world system during this process. This made the environment after each rebirth of the minor kiliocosm to be the best among the other millions of minor kiliocosms. The living creatures born here were much better than those in other worlds. The probability of the birth of experts was also the highest among the entire world system. Chapter 7:14. Although every 5 or 6 billion years, each minor kiliocosm would experience a world-ending calamity, each calamity would cause the cultivators in the minor kiliocosm to experience a qualitative breakthrough. As a result, the number of cultivators that ascended from the minor kiliocosm to the next level would skyrocket. Look after almost 10,000 cycles of life and death, a third of the hundreds of millions of earthly immortal realm cultivators in the dimensional realm had come from this minor thousand world, whereas another half of the remaining two-thirds had ascended from the other 2,999 minor thousand worlds, and the remaining third had grown up in this dimensional realm. Amongst these hundreds of millions of earthly immortal realm cultivators, most of them were naturally at the independent immortal realm. There were only a few hundred true immortal realm cultivators above them, and there were no golden immortal realm cultivators above them at all. At most, there were only a few cultivators who were faintly on the verge of the golden immortal realm, and they could be considered to have barely stepped into the half-step golden immortal realm. Of course, the dimensional world was so vast while the vitality within it was so dense, so it was naturally impossible for it to merely accommodate a few 100 million earthly immortal realm cultivators. In fact, at this moment, there were tens of thousands of times more intelligent beings than the earthly immortal realm cultivators in this dimensional world. In fact, besides these intelligent beings, there were even more beasts, birds, and insects living in this dimensional world. The existence of these beings was obviously not something that had ascended from a minor dimension. Rather, they were created by the natural evolution of this dimensional realm. Every life form had its own unique characteristics of this dimensional realm. Every life form contained the power of good fortune of this dimensional realm. It was because there were so many lives in this dimensional realm that even though only billions of years had passed, this dimensional realm had already reached a point where it could no longer bear the burden. At any time, the smallest fuse could cause a world-destroying calamity to erupt, causing the entire dimensional realm to experience the cycle of life and death. At this moment, Luo Fan was standing on the platform. The boundless inspiration that had been condensed from the various minor kiliocosms over the past trillions of years, and the number of living beings that couldn't even be described by numbers, was surging in his mind. While he felt that his mind had obtained an indescribable cleansing, he also understood the various changes that had occurred in the limitless Void Palace over the past trillions of years. All sorts of inspiration settled in the depths of his mind, and a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. With a light step, Lin Ming arrived at the collapsing dimensional realm and arrived above the Tao Palace of this dimensional realm. This Tao Palace was formed by the combination of the Xuanji Boy and the Zhifang Boy's magic treasures and the laws of this dimensional realm. It was the manifestation of all the principles of this dimensional realm, and it was also the most noble and mysterious place in the entire dimensional realm. At this moment, in this Tao Palace, the Xuanji Boy and the Zhifang Boy, who were revered as supreme beings by the entire realm, solemnly came before Luo Fan and bowed. "Greetings, Master," they said in unison. Luo Fan faintly smiled. He lifted his hand and lifted them up, saying, "You've done well. This dimensional realm is far more prosperous than I expected. Thank you for your praise, Master, but it's still not fast enough. None of these beings could ascend before the cycle of reincarnation. We've failed Master's orders. Please punish us, Master," the Zhifang Boy said with incomparable shame. "Why should I be ashamed? How can it be so easy to become a primordial immortal? The untainted land is blessed by nature. In so many years, apart from our own people, who else has become a primordial immortal? I'd be surprised if a being in this dimensional realm could become a primordial immortal in just a few billion years." Luo Fan shook his head and smiled. As he spoke, he came to the Tao Palace and sat down. This Tao Palace was connected to the laws of the entire dimensional realm, and it also occupied the source of the entire realm's vitality. Sitting in it, one could naturally feel the pulse of the entire realm and the flow of the aura of the entire realm. It was quite a wonderful feeling. Sure enough, I've reached the limit. Fortunately, under the effect of the power of the world's flow, most of the being's life imprints will be reincarnated in other worlds, so they won't really die. I won't waste these trillions of years of good fortune. Luo Fan's thoughts moved slightly as he thought so. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, the entire dimensional realm suddenly began to shake. An aura of annihilation suddenly emerged from nothingness and instantly filled the entire dimensional realm, causing the yuan qi of the entire realm to become violent. At the same time, the beings in this dimensional realm were stung by this aura of annihilation. The contradictions that had accumulated in the past for countless years broke out in an instant. Almost all the beings became desperate. Even if it would lead to the destruction of the world and the death of all living beings, they wanted to end the accumulated hatred in the past. As a result, countless more and more intense battles broke out, and the scope of the battles became wider and wider, causing more and more damage to the dimensional realm. In this dimensional realm, there were hundreds of millions of beings in the third realm of earthly immortals, and the beings in the third realm of earthly immortals, even those in the individual immortal realm, already possessed incredible magical powers. Even for the untainted land, they had considerable destructive power, let alone this dimensional realm, which was 2 realms lower than the untainted land. In a dimensional realm like this, even a cultivator at the bodiless immortal realm was equivalent to a fiend god. The aftershock of every single battle was probably capable of obliterating the heavens and the earth in an area of 5,000 kilometers and transforming it into chaos. In this sort of situation, all living beings would lose all scruples and display their full strength to fight. The destruction that would occur in this dimensional realm could be imagined. Only a short while after the battle began, the aura of annihilation in the entire dimensional realm was already thousands of times thicker than it was at the beginning. And this increasingly thick aura of annihilation caused the beings in the entire dimensional realm to become more and more fearless. The battles also became more and more terrifying, and the destruction caused became more and more severe. Thus, the piercing aura of annihilation became more and more intense. In this way, it formed an incomparably tragic vicious cycle. I didn't expect that it would actually be my thought that would cause this apocalyptic calamity. In the Tao Palace, Luo Fan didn't need to rely on his own senses to see all the changes in the entire dimensional realm, and he couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Compared to tens of thousands of years ago, Luo Fan's knowledge had already increased by countless times. With just a slight perception, he understood why there would be such a coincidence. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, the great calamity of this dimensional realm would be triggered. It was obvious that the apocalyptic calamity of this dimensional realm was triggered by this thought of Luo Fan. In other words, it was precisely because of this thought that appeared in Luo Fan's mind that the apocalyptic calamity that needed some time to brew was directly triggered in advance. The principle behind this seemed to be very profound, but it was actually extremely simple. It was because this dimensional realm was created by Luo Fan with the help of the primal chaos divine lightning. It could be said that Luo Fan was the creator of this dimensional realm. On the other hand, he himself possessed the cultivation of the all-heaven true Tao, and his divine ability had already attained an unbelievable realm. His every action and thought would naturally form various unbelievable laws and laws. These laws and laws might not be stable, and their influence wasn't great. In the great desolate world, they couldn't really cause great changes to the great desolate world. But in this dimensional realm, these laws and laws could almost directly suppress the countless laws and laws that existed in the dimensional realm itself. They could directly replace the great Tao that had controlled this dimensional realm for hundreds of millions of years. As a result, his thought was about to trigger the apocalyptic calamity that had been brewing to its limit. How could it be an incredible thing? However, the destruction of a world was an extremely tragic scene. Even if Luo Fan's Tao heart was perfect, even if his mind was flawless, even if he had seen the apocalyptic calamity of the great desolate world, even if he knew that this was the inevitable evolution of the world, he still couldn't help but feel pity. He couldn't face it indifferently. Therefore, he couldn't help but let out such a sigh. While Luo Fan was sighing, the apocalyptic calamity had developed to a point where it couldn't be stopped. It formed a domino effect. Like a landslide or tsunami, the entire dimensional realm was stirred up. The entire dimensional realm began to crack and collapse. More and more space cracks appeared in the void. At first it was only a faint shimmer, but eventually it spread out like a spiderweb, covering the entire dimensional realm. The entire dimensional realm was wrapped up in these spiderweb-like space cracks, causing the entire dimensional realm to look like a broken piece of porcelain that was on the verge of collapsing. With the entire dimensional realm undergoing such a drastic change, the Tao Palace that was the hub of the entire dimensional realm, the center of all rules, laws, and even the source of all life, was now covered with countless cracks. It was clear that as the dimensional realm collapsed and was destroyed, the Tao Palace would also collapse and be destroyed. Luo Fan sighed. He lifted a finger and the Tao Palace was instantly stripped away from the dimensional realm, turning into a pure building. It completely lost all of its previous uses and no longer had any connection with the dimensional realm. Although it had lost its uses, because it was cut off from the outside world, the Tao Palace no longer needed to share the same fate as the dimensional realm. It wouldn't collapse along with the dimensional realm. Thank you, Master, for saving us. The avatars of Zhifeng Boy and Xuanji Boy bowed to Luo Fan. The destruction of the dimensional realm naturally didn't affect Zhifeng Boy and Xuanji Boy's main bodies at all. They wouldn't be damaged by the destruction of the dimensional realm. But for these two avatars, the destruction of the dimensional realm was a calamity. It would completely destroy the will that they had developed over billions of years and cause them to perish. Although they would be reborn in the dimensional realm because of the existence of their main bodies, they would no longer be themselves. Rather, they would be a completely new avatar, a completely new incarnation. Even though they still had the memories of all these years and the perception of all these years, their emotions were no longer the same as they were now. They were avatars of magic treasures and didn't have a mind of their own. But they still had everything that normal life forms had. They naturally didn't lack the desire to live. If they couldn't change their fate of death, then they might be able to calmly accept it. But if they could survive, how could they possibly choose death? And Luo Fan's method of separating the Tao Palace from the dimensional realm had clearly changed their fate of death. That was why there was such a bow of thanks. Luo Fan shook his head and didn't say anything. At this time, the Tao Palace had already lost all of its uses. If he wanted to observe the dimensional realm, he could only rely on his own perception and his own eyes. For him, this naturally wasn't difficult at all. But this change in perspective allowed him to see the process of the dimensional realm's destruction even more clearly. It allowed him to feel the scene of the world's destruction more directly. In this sort of situation, he naturally didn't care about the feelings of Xuanji Boy and Zhifeng Boy. Although the Tao Palace was still in the dimensional realm, everything that happened in the dimensional realm was like it was happening in another time and space. It didn't affect the Tao Palace at all. Even if the void where the Tao Palace was completely shattered, it didn't have the slightest effect on the Tao Palace. The changes in the dimensional realm were extremely intense. Soon, the entire void of the dimensional realm had collapsed into countless tiny spatial fragments. These fragments turned into wind dragons that circled the void of the dimensional realm, wiping out all matter and all life that dared to enter their range of influence. The earth had already cracked into countless parts. Magma and evil energy surged out, violently reacting with the surrounding seawater. It produced countless poisonous smoke that gradually spread throughout the entire dimensional realm. Under such a drastic change, even if the many life forms in the dimensional realm were stronger than ordinary life forms and their vitality was more tenacious, they still couldn't withstand such a drastic change. Large numbers of life forms continued to die. In just a quarter of an hour, the number of living beings in this dimensional realm had been reduced by more than 90%. Only those cultivators with some cultivation base, loose immortals, and true immortals were still fighting each other to the death. At this moment, their minds were already filled with hatred, and everything that happened in the outside world had become extremely secondary to them. They had become extremely illusory, and they couldn't pay any attention to anything at all. In this case, how could they restrain their actions for the sake of the death of so many life forms? The process continued to develop. Those cultivators with some cultivation base and cultivation base were also dying in this process. They were constantly dying. After every life died, there would be some sort of marvelous rule that would act upon their life mark. Most of these life marks would disappear from this dimensional realm through these rules and reincarnate into another dimension or dimensional realm. Only a small portion of life marks couldn't withstand this law. The moment the law acted on them, they collapsed and died. After several hours, the entire dimensional realm was finally unable to maintain its basic structure. A loud sound that shook the souls of all the surviving life forms resounded in the air. The entire dimensional realm finally collapsed. All of space, all of time, all of matter, all of energy, all of it disintegrated after this loud sound. It was as if everything had been stirred by a blender, forming a chaotic state. This state was neither big nor small, neither inside nor outside. It felt as if there was no end to it, and one would never be able to find the edge of it. However, from the outside it was extremely small, almost like a tiny singularity. At this time, Luo Fan was in the Tao Palace, and the Tao Palace was in this incomparably chaotic state. Naturally, it felt as if there was no end to it, as if there was no end to it. The destruction of a world is always a tragedy. Luo Fan sighed. He stood up, lifted his foot, and stepped out of the Tao Palace. He stepped out of the ruins of the dimensional realm, and arrived on the platform above. With a thought, he saw the 3 levels of the world system, as well as the dimensional realm in the second level. He could see that it was a tiny dot. Around that dot, the 3,000 minor dimensions were still the same as before the dimensional realm was intact. They didn't seem to have changed because of the collapse of the dimensional realm. After all, to the outside world, the dimensional realm still existed. The essence of the world, its power, its time, and its space were still there. There wasn't any overall change. In such a situation, there naturally wasn't any change to the outside world. Naturally, it wouldn't destroy the integrity of the world system. Luo Fan personally entered the dimensional realm to observe the destruction of the dimensional realm. This was because he wanted to feel how the world within the system completed the cycle of life and death of a world. Although the previous developments had caught him off guard, he had still completed half of his goal. Now that the other half of his goal was about to be completed, he naturally wouldn't let it go. His attention was focused on the dimensional realm, waiting for the next changes to occur. At this time, in the other 9 million dimensional realms, there were traces of indescribably wonderful existences that flowed through the tiny dot through mysterious channels. During this process, these wonderful existences didn't decrease in the slightest. But because they flowed through, the tiny dot began to undergo all sorts of mysterious changes. It was as if these existences that flowed through the tiny dot were some sort of inconceivable catalyst that was causing the tiny dot to undergo mysterious changes. Chapter 7:15. In the blink of an eye, the Huanluan state inside the small dot became more and more intense. In the blink of an eye, it had reached a certain limit. Text first. The process of the Huanluan evolving towards order after the destruction of the world was clearly a kind of creation of the world. It was just that there was no external force acting on it. There was no incredibly powerful force like Pangu or Du Tian's chaotic divine thunder. Instead, it was naturally created when the Huanluan state evolved to the extreme. This process of creation naturally did not cause any earth-shattering movement. Instead, it was incomparably natural. It was like a bowl of muddy sewage gradually settling down over time, and finally becoming clear again. This process of evolution may seem like a short while to the outside world, but to the Xuanji boy and the Zhifang boy in the ruins of the medium-class world, from the time Luo Fan left this Huanluan area to the time when this area changed, it was unknown how many billions of years had passed. The reason for this difference was very simple. It was because in this incomparably vast area, even time had changed into countless fragments. space, matter, energy, and all other existences that once existed in this dimensional realm had fused together with it. For space, they had the Taoist palace, which could support their survival in this area. But for time, they had to bear the influence of this Huanluan area. And this influence caused their perception of time to be Huanluan. A short while in the outside world, to them, was unknown how many billions of years. If it were not for the fact that the two of them were magic treasure clones and did not have any consciousness of their own, during such a long period of time, their minds would have long collapsed and their original spirits would have dissipated. After all, the feeling of surviving in this Huanluan state was naturally completely different from surviving in a complete medium-class world. To survive in a complete medium-class world, there were trillions of living beings in the entire medium-class world, and each of these living beings was completely different from any other living beings. Every life form had their own unique thoughts, their own unique goals. In this sort of situation, with so many life forms gathered together, it would naturally produce countless incredible effects. This caused the entire dimensional realm to become incomparably colorful. At every moment, the two of them were able to find something they were interested in, something they had never seen before, something they had never experienced before, something they could observe, experience, and feel. In this kind of situation, even if they lived for trillions of years, they would still be able to find a sense of novelty. They would not feel lonely, let alone bored. But at this time, in this boundless Huanluan state, the situation was naturally completely different. In this Huanluan state, although time, space, matter, energy, and everything else was constantly changing, in their eyes, this change was unimaginably slow. It was as if time had frozen, and the entire Huanluan state was completely still. It was unknown how many years it would take to see a trace of change. It was easy to imagine how lonely and boring such a situation was. And to the two of them, this kind of life had passed for trillions of years. How could this be an easy thing to bear? However, even if it was difficult to bear, as magic treasure avatars, they were still able to bear all of this. And after withstanding this indescribable loneliness, boredom, and dryness, they also obtained a considerable amount of benefits. Their spiritual sense underwent unimaginable tempering in this process. The traces of impurities in their spiritual sense were purified in this process. Their minds and willpower were greatly improved, and their minds became clearer. In addition, the evolution of this Huanluan state was, after all, a process where things would move in the opposite direction when they reached an extreme. They watched the entire process and naturally understood the mystery of the creation of the world. Although they might not necessarily be able to create some kind of method or obtain a huge improvement in the nature of the magic treasure, it could allow their nature to gradually surpass other magic treasure avatars. In the future, if Xuanji Boy and Jifeng Boy retracted all of their avatars, they might be able to leave a trace of their original body. Instead of being completely annihilated like before, clear and turbid were separated, time and space were formed, the earth, the sea, the mountains, and the rivers were constantly born and evolving in this small dot. And in the eyes of Luo Fan in the outside world, the small dot gradually expanded and eventually became the same as other medium-sized worlds. At first glance, there seemed to be no difference, but after careful observation, one would find that this medium-sized world was much vaster and more stable than other medium-sized worlds. The spiritual vigor was also much richer. The entire process seemed to Luo Fan only took a few breaths. But in the eyes of Xuanji Boy and Jifeng Boy's avatars in this world, thousands of years had passed. And compared to the endless time in the Huanluan state, this period of time was already unimaginably short, and their feelings were almost the complete opposite of that time. Back then, they could not wait for that period of time to pass quickly, but in these thousands of years, they could not wait for time to stop, so that this process of time would never end. The reason for this difference was naturally because of their almost completely opposite experiences in these two processes. In the process of existing in the Huanluan state, they were constantly suffering from loneliness, dullness, and the erosion of boredom. Not even a second had passed. Under such circumstances, they naturally could not wait for this period of time to pass quickly. But at this time, in the process of the formation of the world, they were witnessing the most magnificent, most mysterious, and most mysterious process in the boundless universe at every moment, the complete process of the creation of the world. This process was an incomparably precious process for any living being, any cultivator, and even for magic treasures. To living beings and cultivators, they could understand all kinds of principles of the creation of the world, which could improve their souls, and their cultivation base through the understanding of this process. For magic treasures, engraving this process in a spirit stone would naturally reflect the body of the magic treasure, allowing the body of the magic treasure to change accordingly, allowing the power of the magic treasure to increase beyond imagination. At this moment, specifically for the avatars of Xuanji Boy and Jifeng Boy, these two avatars could carry more of their imprints on their bodies, allowing them to occupy more important positions in their bodies in the end. It was even possible for their spiritual consciousness to grow to a realm where it could occupy the main part of their body's spiritual consciousness, and the significance of this to an avatar was naturally extraordinary. It was precisely because of this that the avatars of Xuanji Boy and Jifeng Boy wished for this process to continue forever and never end. However, time would not change because of their expectations. At the very least, with their current realms, time would not change because of their expectations. No matter how reluctant they were, this process would gradually come to an end. At a certain moment, when the dimensional world's changes completely stabilized, the earth no longer shook, time and space no longer trembled, the mountains and rivers no longer shifted, and endless vitality began to seep out from the source of vitality, the two avatars of Xuanji Boy and Jifeng Boy finally regretfully admitted that the evolution of this dimensional world had come to an end. And at this moment, the Tao Palace that they resided in began to follow the procedure that Luo Fan had set up. In a flash, it disappeared from the dimensional world. When it reappeared, it was in the new source of vitality of this dimensional world. Before the dimensional world was destroyed and reborn, the location where the Tao Palace was originally located was the source of vitality. But at this moment, this world had already been destroyed and reborn. The rules and laws of this dimensional world had undergone earth-shattering changes compared to before. The location of the source of vitality had naturally changed, and it was impossible for it to exist like before. Therefore, the Tao Palace needed to be moved again in order to reach the new source of vitality. When it arrived at the source of vitality, the Tao Palace trembled slightly and turned from illusory to solid. It was as if it had finally crossed the barrier of time and space to enter this dimensional world. From its original illusory and distant state, it gradually became real. When it completely became real, countless tiny cracks instantly appeared on the Tao Palace, covering every inch of the Tao Palace. These cracks were incomparably dense. Originally, they were very small, but after they appeared, they grew at an unimaginable speed. In the blink of an eye, the entire Tao Palace had been turned into countless tiny fragments. Although it still maintained the general shape of the Tao Palace, it was as if it was completely made of sand. With just a light poke, it would completely collapse. After this change, the dimensional world suddenly faintly trembled. The endless rules and laws that had already stabilized suddenly became active once more. Through some incomparably mysterious method, the rules and laws turned from illusory to solid and poured into the Tao Palace that looked like it was made of sand. As these rules and laws poured into the Tao Palace, the aura of the Tao Palace gradually changed, and the tiny fragments also gradually condensed. In a breath's time, the entire Tao Palace had become incomparably complete. Even its shape had undergone an earth-shattering change. Its aura had completely fused with the dimensional world, as if the two were originally one. It was clear that this Tao Palace was the Tao Palace of the dimensional realm before it was destroyed. Now, it had become the Tao Palace of the current dimensional realm. After the Tao Palace's changes stopped, the Xuanji boy and Jifeng boy's doppelgangers finally calmed down. They came outside the Tao Palace, knelt down, and kowtowed to Luo Fan, who was outside the dimensional world, and thanked Luo Fan for giving them such a supreme lucky chance. Their kowtow naturally did not receive a response. At this time, Luo Fan had already shifted his attention away from the dimensional world. Even if he sensed their kowtow, he would not waste any effort to respond to them. After all, they were only one of Luo Fan's 2 magical weapons that contained nearly 10 million avatars. The lucky chance he had given them to survive the destruction of his dimensional realm and be reborn was only because of his mood at that time. It wasn't because he looked at them differently. At this time, his mood had already passed, so he naturally did not care too much about them. The doppelgangers of Jifeng boy and Xuanji boy did not expect a response from Luo Fan. After kowtowing, they returned to the Tao Palace and continued the task that they had to do in the previous era. They began to work hard to think of ways to promote the growth of the living beings in this dimensional world. Although this dimensional world had just been reborn, it was still filled with endless vitality. Therefore, at this moment there were already many living beings in this dimensional world, and they could be born at any time. Therefore, the 2 of them still did not have time to relax. Luo Fan sat on the platform. The flow of time at his position was the same as the flow of time in the Limitless Palace's minor kiliacosm, which had the fastest flow of time. It was also 365 times the flow of time in a dimensional world, and more than 48 million times the flow of time in the Great Wasteland. Previously, before the dimensional world was completely reborn, the flow of time could not be completely stabilized. There was no difference from the outside world. Therefore, even if Luo Fan stood on this platform, he could still easily see the evolution of the dimensional world as if there was no difference in the flow of time. But at this moment the situation was different. At this time, the changes in the dimensional world had already stopped. The flow of time had naturally stabilized at 365 times that of the Great Thousand World, and 365 times that of the Minor Thousand World. In this situation, when Luo Fan looked at the dimensional world, it was like watching a slow-motion movie that had been slowed down by 365 times. Not only was it boring, it was also difficult for him to obtain any enlightenment. Therefore, at this time, he placed more attention on the other minor kiliacosms. After trillions of years, the various minor kiliacosms were no longer the same as they were when they were first created. The number of living beings in each minor kiliacosm had already reached the realm of perfection, and there was no longer any feeling of emptiness or loneliness. The inspiration that was produced at every moment had also reached the limit of these minor kiliacosms. In other words, even if time was pushed back to the Great Wasteland for billions of years, the amount of inspiration produced by these minor kiliacosms would not be able to increase compared to the amount at this time. Sitting cross-legged on the platform and observing these minor kiliacosms, there was suddenly a sense of perfection coming from them. Not all of the minor kiliacosms were full of vitality. There were many minor kiliacosms that were clearly heading towards destruction and destruction. However, when all of the minor kiliacosms were combined together, an indescribable vitality was brewing. It was brewing a vast sense of perfection that filled the entire everlasting palace and even affected Luo Fan at this moment. It seems that the development of the minor kiliacosms has reached the end, and it can be considered to be truly perfect. It's a pity that the development of the medium kiliacosms and the Great Thousand World is still incomplete, and there is still a long way to go before they are truly perfect. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. After the Void Wuji Palace had been reforged by Luo Fan, not only did the number of worlds in it increase to nearly 10 million, but its realm had also been raised to the level of a Daluo heavenly treasure. Although a Daluo heavenly treasure was different from a Daluo Dao fruit, it was still a Daluo heavenly treasure. Since it was a Daluo heavenly treasure, it naturally had to be perfect. Therefore, this limitless void palace also contained the intent of perfection. It was precisely because of this that the millions of worlds within the limitless void palace could form such a perfect and vibrant world system. However, although the system of this world was perfect, it did not mean that these worlds could no longer be improved. On the contrary, this kind of perfection was only the perfection of the whole, the perfection of the whole. When it came to the various layers of the world, this kind of perfection no longer existed. This was only natural. How could there be a world that was complete and perfect as soon as it was created? Even the prehistorical world needed Pangu's backbone to support it when it was created, not to mention these small, medium, and small worlds. In order to make each layer of the world perfect, it would require an endless amount of time to develop and support. And this period of time was already enough for the minor kiliacosm. Therefore, at the bottom of the world system, the whole of the minor kiliacosm had become perfect and complete. But on the other hand, the time that passed in the medium-class world was only one of 365 times that of the minor kiliacosm. Trillions of years in the minor kiliacosm could allow its entire system to evolve to perfection, but for the medium-class world, it was only billions of years, which was not enough for it to evolve to perfection. Therefore, at this moment, the medium-class world was still not perfect. The medium-class world did not have enough time to be perfect, and the time flow in the major kiliacosm was one of 365 times that of the medium-class world. Naturally, it was even more impossible for it to be perfect. Because of this, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The cultivation of the Daluo heavenly treasure was to deepen and expand the perfection. At this moment, the medium-class world and the major kiliacosm world had been perfected, which naturally meant that the void Wuji skill could not completely stabilize the Daluo heavenly treasure realm. Not to mention the pursuit of improvement, if it was not refined for a long time, it might even fall to the Daluo heavenly treasure realm and fall to the primordial unity dark treasure realm. Of course, this period of time might be extremely long, and it might even be calculated in billions of years. But the essence of not completely stabilizing the Daluo heavenly treasure realm would not change because of the long process of falling. In order for the Void Wuji Palace to truly stabilize the Daluo heavenly treasure realm, it needed the three layers of the world system, the minor kiliacosm world, and the medium-class world to be truly perfect. Only then could it be considered as stabilizing the Daluo heavenly treasure realm, and it would not fall because it was not refined for a long time. As for how to raise it to the peak of the Daluo heavenly treasure realm, or even break through to the Daluo heavenly treasure realm, the premise was that every small kiliacosm and medium-class world had become perfect. Chapter 7:16. Luo Fan sensed the perfect aura coming from the mini kiliacosm layer, and a little enlightenment emerged in his mind. Text first. After a while, he finally broke away from the enlightenment. He only felt that he had a deeper understanding of the Daluo realm, and he also had a better understanding of the Daluo truth path. Although the Daluo heavenly treasure was the same realm as the Daluo realm, it was a magic treasure of a certain level after all. It could not be divided into the three small realms of Daluo Loose Dao, Truth Dao, and Metal Dao. Instead, it directly corresponded to the sum of the three realms of Daluo. This undoubtedly made the Daluo heavenly treasure realm unimaginably huge, making it almost impossible to break through the realm and become a mixed-origin spiritual treasure. But at the same time, even when the Daluo heavenly treasure had just been formed, it still contained some of the mysteries of the three small realms of Daluo. Therefore, the current limitless void palace was far from Luo Fan in terms of realm, but it also contained some of the mysteries that Luo Fan needed to understand in the Daluo truth path realm, so it naturally made Luo Fan feel enlightened. After the enlightenment, Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes, and the expression on his face became extremely calm. An eternal great perfection slowly emanated from his body, spreading throughout the entire limitless void palace, enveloping the more than 9 million square worlds, making the perfection of the mini-kiliocosm layer become more and more perfect under its influence, making the medium kiliocosm layer, which was originally still a long way from perfection, slowly step into perfection. As for the vast kiliocosm, there was not even a living being that had ascended. It was barren and desolate at the moment. How could it be perfect? Even the great perfection that enveloped Luo Fan did not change because of this, as if he did not feel it at all. At this moment, Luo Fan was once again using the nameless technique that was created specifically to understand the scene of the Sword Madman's creation. At this moment, he had already broken through the Grand Luo Loose Tao and attained the Grand Luo True Tao. The barrier between the 8th and 9th level of the nameless technique was broken with a loud bang. The mental particle that had enveloped Lunatic Sword's Genesis splitter in his mind instantly collapsed and reassembled, becoming even more complicated, profound, and unbelievable. Afterwards, traces of mysteries continuously floated out and were directly received by Luo Fan's mind. It made Luo Fan feel that his understanding of the Daluo truth path was constantly deepening, and he was constantly comprehending the incredible mysteries contained in it. During this process, his cultivation realm began to rise at an indiscernible speed, stepping towards an unfathomable supreme height. As for the inspirations transmitted by the living beings in the Void Wuji Palace, they were directly absorbed into the depths of his memory, allowing them to accumulate and ferment, waiting for him to trigger them in the future and produce various magical effects. Obviously, for Luo Fan, although these inspirations were of great benefit to him, and could even serve as the foundation for him to achieve the Tao, but relatively speaking, the mysteries of the Zenith Heaven Truth Way that floated out from the scene of the lunatic swordsman creating the world was more important. After all, the higher his cultivation realm, the more gains he could obtain from these inspirations. If he wanted to improve his cultivation realm, he only needed to continuously use the nameless technique to receive the mysteries that floated out from the mental particle. Did he still need to think about how to choose? As Luo Fan's cultivation realm improved, the great perfection aura that emanated from his body also continued to rise. The influence on the many worlds in the Void Wuji Palace was also constantly increasing. This influence caused the power of the Void Wuji Palace to constantly increase, and the realm of the great Luo Heavenly Treasure was also constantly stepping towards true stability. The 9th level of the nameless technique corresponded to the realm of the Grand Luo True Tao. The previous 8th level corresponded to the realm of the Grand Luo Loose Tao, and it had already taken 100 billion years. At this time, the time needed for the 9th level was at least 10 times that of the 8th level, and it was impossible to achieve it without 1 trillion years. Such a long time, before the Void Wuji Palace was reforged, even Luo Fan could not squander so much time. But the situation was completely different now. At this moment, the flow of time in the Void Wuji Palace could reach more than 48 million times that of the primordial world. The flow of time on the platform that Luo Fan was on had reached the limit of the flow of time in the Void Wuji Palace. In other words, 48 million years had passed here, and only 1 year had passed in the primordial world. In this way, 1 trillion years was only 20 to 30,000 years in the primordial world. It was not even half a yuan hui. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally had a lot of time to squander. While Luo Fan was cultivating in seclusion to increase his cultivation realm, the primordial world entered a calm state after a great calamity. The entire primordial world was filled with endless vitality at all times, fusing with every part of the primordial world, constantly giving birth to all kinds of living beings. The great calamity of the primordial world even had to be reforged. The many ordinary living beings living in it naturally found it difficult to survive. As a result, after the great calamity, although the entire primordial world was vast and boundless, and the vitality was unimaginably dense, it was desolate, barren, and desolate. It was even more miserable than the primordial world that Luo Fan had seen when he had just transmigrated. Under such circumstances, the endless life force seemed to be recreating all living beings in the void. However, there was no need to follow any template, nor was there any need to worry about the living beings that originally existed. As long as the supreme great Tao flowed, it would naturally condense life force, vitality, and matter, giving birth to the endless living beings that were most compatible with the primordial world. Some of these living beings were similar to the living beings that existed before the Great Calamity, but most of them were completely different. They seemed to be more compatible with the primordial world, more compatible with the supreme great Tao, more compatible with the endless vitality of the world, and more compatible with the boundless primordial world. After the great calamity of the world, the chaotic vitality in the primordial world had almost been exhausted. Among the vitality that filled the entire world, the innate vitality was the most abundant. Other than the innate vitality, there was also the essence of the stars, the aura, the murderous aura, and the other vitality that existed in the primordial world. However, other than that, there was another type of vitality that occupied a position second only to the innate vitality. It affected the birth of living beings in the entire primordial world. This vitality was the postnatal vitality of the world. It was a type of vitality that was born after the innate vitality was contaminated with the postnatal aura. It was extremely stable and powerful. It was easier to sense and be absorbed by living beings than the innate vitality. However, it no longer had the effect of replenishing the lifespan of living beings. When a world was just created, because the internal vitality was contaminated with the aura of chaos, it possessed some magical power. It could produce innate gods, innate spiritual roots, and even innate treasures. However, this kind of chaotic vitality was extremely unstable. It was evolving at almost every moment, losing the chaotic aura within it, and finally becoming innate vitality. This was an extremely fast process for a region of the world. However, it would take at least a few hundred yuanhui to achieve the exact time. A few hundred yuanhui was naturally an extremely short period of time to a world. It was almost the same as the blink of an eye. However, compared to living beings and the innate gods born from the chaotic vitality, this period of time was long enough. It was enough for the first batch of innate gods to truly grow with the help of the chaotic vitality and possess supreme divine abilities. Because of this, living beings that appeared at the beginning of the world would definitely achieve great things in the future and possess great divine abilities. On the other hand, the innate vitality that the chaotic vitality had degenerated into after losing its chaotic aura was naturally many times weaker than the chaotic vitality. The difference was so great that it could not be compared. In fact, the innate gods at the beginning of the world would not even bother to absorb it. However, this kind of innate vitality also had all kinds of incredible uses and unimaginable power. Among them, the greatest power and the strongest use was to replenish the lifespan of living beings. As long as a living being could breathe the innate power at all times, the life force it consumed at every moment would be constantly replenished, allowing it to live forever. As long as there were no accidents, it would never have to worry about the loss of its life force. It was precisely because of this that in the ancient times, living beings had extremely long lifespans. Almost all living beings could live forever as long as they were not suppressed by external forces. Of course, this did not mean that all living beings that breathed in the innate vitality could live forever. In fact, it was the opposite. Very few living beings could live for too long. Usually, hundreds, thousands, or at most tens of thousands of years were already their limit. After all living beings had the ability to live forever. This meant that powerful living beings would become more and more powerful, and the living environment for ordinary living beings would become more and more harsh. Under such circumstances, the long lifespan of ordinary living beings was just the shelf life of powerful living beings. In the end, they would still die at the hands of powerful living beings or in the harsh natural environment outside. Innate vitality was much more stable than chaotic vitality, but it was still extremely active. It was still constantly losing its innate aura, and was still evolving into another type of acquired vitality. However, it was still more stable than chaotic vitality, so the time needed to completely evolve was not something that could be completely evolved in just a few hundred millennia. It would take at least billions of years, tens of billions of years, or even thousands of years, before it could completely evolve into acquired vitality. This period of time was already a rather long period of time, even for innate gods. Under normal circumstances, it would take at least hundreds of millennia for the chaotic vitality to completely disappear. After that, it would enter an extremely long period of time, where innate vitality dominated for billions of years, tens of billions of years, or even hundreds of billions of years. This was the so-called ancient times, which would last for billions of years, tens of billions of years, or even hundreds of billions of years. Only then could all the innate vitality in the world completely evolve into acquired vitality, and become the acquired vitality of the world. The acquired vitality of the world was the vitality derived from the innate vitality of the world. Its stability had almost reached the extreme. Not to mention chaotic vitality, it was millions of times more stable than innate vitality. The stability of this vitality did not mean that it could not be used, but the speed at which it degenerated had been slowed down to the extreme. Almost as soon as it was born, it would not degenerate or change for billions of years until the end of the world, until the destruction of the universe, until the so-called Dharma ending age. Only then could it truly degenerate into another type of vitality and disappear without a trace. Under normal circumstances, the primordial world should naturally take this path. Chaotic vitality lasted hundreds of millennia, innate vitality lasted hundreds of billions of years, and acquired vitality lasted hundreds of billions of years before the world was destroyed. However, the two great tribulations of the world that the primordial world had experienced since its birth had changed this process. The first great tribulation of the world was the heavenly demonic tribulation. After this tribulation, the primordial world had an additional one. 296 billion grotto heaven worlds, as well as countless types of strange beasts and living beings. At the same time, the process of the primordial world, taking hundreds of millennia to evolve into innate vitality, was shortened by more than half, allowing more than half of the chaotic vitality to turn into innate vitality. After that, the second great tribulation of the world, which was also the tribulation of the falling stars that had just passed, was 1,000 times greater than the first great tribulation of the world. It almost reshaped the entire primordial world. The tribulation of the world made all the vitality in the entire primordial world go through a brand new cycle and a brand new transformation. During this process, the tribulation of the world turned more than half of the chaotic vitality into innate vitality, making it difficult to find chaotic vitality that naturally existed in the primordial world. In fact, it did not end there. Instead, it continued to transform the endless innate vitality that originally existed in the world, turning innate vitality into acquired vitality, causing endless stable acquired vitality to appear in the world. It directly completed a small portion of the process that would have taken hundreds of billions of years to complete. The reason why there was such a change was because the intensity of the Great Tribulation of the world this time was too great. It had almost exceeded the limits of the primordial world. Normally, the second Great Tribulation of the world that appeared in a perfect world would usually only be about 10 times stronger than the previous Great Tribulation of the world. It might not be a specific multiple, but it would definitely be at this level. The third Great Tribulation of the world would be about 10 times stronger than the second. In this way, only the fourth great tribulation of the world would be 1,000 times stronger than the first great tribulation of the world. Originally, only 10 times stronger than the great tribulation of the world was enough to break through the limits of the primordial world, causing it to transform and obtain a qualitative improvement. At this moment, the multiplier had increased to 1,000 times. How could the primordial world withstand this? If not for Luo Fan's existence, if not for Luo Fan obtaining the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit and reaching the peak of the Zenith Heaven dispelling Tao, the primordial world would not have been able to survive this great tribulation of the world. At this moment, there were probably only some ruins of the primordial world in this chaotic state. At most, there were some innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights that could occasionally flicker in the chaotic state, indicating that there had once been an extremely magnificent and perfect world here. It was precisely because the strength of the great tribulation of the world was too great and far exceeded the normal range that the four-faced, eight-armed existence was surprised that the primordial world could become like this after only undergoing two great tribulations of the world. It was also because of this that a small half of the innate origin chi in the primordial world could transcend time and directly evolve into acquired origin chi of the world, speeding up the development of the primordial world by hundreds of billions of years. For living beings and cultivators, the transformation of innate vitality into acquired vitality was naturally not something worth celebrating. It could even be said to be a disaster. After all, the transformation of innate vitality into acquired vitality would cause them to lose the ability to obtain longevity as long as they breathed, making it even more difficult for them to increase their realm. However, this process was an extremely good thing for the world. This meant that it had taken a huge step towards true maturity and completion. If a world was filled with unstable origin chi that was constantly evolving into another state, then it meant that the world itself was unstable and evolving into another state. It meant that there was an extremely high possibility of an accident happening to it, triggering a tribulation, or even collapsing out of thin air. Under such circumstances, the originally unstable connate primordial chi evolved into the extremely stable postnatal primordial chi of heaven and earth. The unstable becoming stable was obviously an extremely good thing for the primordial world. The composition of the vitality in the primordial world was different from before. The living beings that were born were completely compatible with the supreme great Tao of the primordial world and the endless vitality. Naturally, they became extremely different from the living beings that were born in the past. However, the living beings that were born were still born from the primordial world. After all, they were still compatible with the primordial world and relied on the same matter. As a result, they still contained many traces of the living beings that had existed in the primordial world in the past. As a result, the newly born living beings were still able to tell at a glance that they were born from the primordial world. In fact, if one continued to distinguish and search hard, they might even be able to find some of the characteristics of the living beings in the past. This situation made the many living beings born in the primordial world seem like the descendants of the many living beings before the Great Tribulation of the world. Many of the legends of later generations may have originated from this point. Q. Chapter 7:17. The primordial world broke away from desolation day by day. Vitality spread throughout the primordial world at an unimaginable speed, causing the entire primordial world to become more and more lively, and the species of living beings born in it became more and more abundant. Text first. During this process, the surviving living beings that had been sealed in the great tribulation of heaven and earth also woke up one after another. Most of these living beings were the most powerful individuals of a certain race, and could almost represent that race. Among the remaining small number, most of them were demons, and only a very small number were experts of the human clan. These surviving living beings had just woken up from their slumber and discovered that such a huge change had occurred in the world. Even the primordial chi that filled the void had completely changed its nature, becoming difficult to absorb and use. They were all extremely panicked, and even had the thought that they had been abandoned by the entire world. Before they were sealed, the great tribulation of heaven and earth had just begun. They did not have an incredible macro perspective like Luo Fan, so they did not know the truth at all. As for the drastic changes in the world, they only thought that the battle between the human clan and the demon clan had broken the world. The primordial world had such a huge improvement. Why did they feel that the world had been broken? This was not difficult to understand at all. After all, their vision and cultivation had limited their perspective. The primordial world was boundless, and it was impossible for them to completely grasp the overall changes in the primordial world. They could only rely on their relatively shallow perspective to piece together the overall situation of the primordial world bit by bit. In this way, what they obtained was naturally that the land of the primordial world had been shattered into pieces. More than half of the primordial chi of the primordial world had been consumed due to the battle. Although the density had increased compared to before, it had degraded by a large level. More importantly, in the sky, the light of the sun, the moon, and the stars had all become extremely weak. Even the astral wind, lightning, and fire layer that had covered the 9 heavens for an unknown amount of time was nowhere to be found. Was this not a sign that the world had already been destroyed? With this kind of view, no matter how indifferent the living beings were, they could not help but feel sad. The boundless hatred that had accumulated in their hearts in the past seemed so meaningless in this situation. How could it still occupy their thoughts? It was even to the extent that their enemies in the past were the only people they were familiar with and their only companions in this shattered world. So it was naturally impossible for them to arouse any hatred towards them. As a result, as living beings woke up one after another, there were many living beings who had enmity with each other and wanted to cut each other into 1,000 pieces and destroy each other's souls. They looked at the newly born living beings in this world, who seemed to be related to the living beings before the great calamity, as if they were their juniors. Once they encountered them, they would definitely take good care of them, teach them cultivation methods, or build a place for them to live. In this way, the newly born living beings in the primordial world were countless times luckier than the living beings when the primordial world was first created. Not only were their techniques passed down by seniors, even the natural environment of the world was no longer as bad as before. This was not difficult to understand. The yuan qi in the world had become stable, and the changes that occurred were naturally calmer. To living beings, the environment was naturally no longer as bad. After thousands of years, the primordial world was already covered in vegetation. The number of various living beings had reached an unimaginable level, even more than the peak before the great calamity. Among these living beings, the number of intelligent living beings with complete spiritual senses was naturally an extremely small portion of the entire population. However, in terms of overall numbers, it was enough to form hundreds or thousands of intelligent races. The growth of these races relied on the protection of the many living beings that had survived before the great calamity. As a result, many legends before the great calamity gradually appeared in the primordial world. The heavenly wasteland emperor, the demonic ancestor, the Tao sovereign Buzhou mountain, the astral wind, lightning, and fire layer, the supreme sky tree, the Fusang tree. All these people and things that were extremely ordinary before the great calamity had already become legendary existences. Even the creatures that had survived had many more honorific. The 6 ancestors and 8 saints, the 3 gods and 7 Buddhas, all of them had an unimaginable status in the hearts of the living beings of the primordial world. Various cultivation techniques had also spread throughout the primordial world during this process, causing the cultivation civilization of the primordial world to gradually prosper again. However, these cultivation techniques were already extremely different from the many cultivation techniques before the great calamity. Before the Great Calamity, the cultivation techniques that the many living beings in the world cultivated were exquisite. They did not absorb chaotic yuan qi, and even the extremely poor cultivation techniques needed to absorb connate yuan qi. The power of the various techniques that they cultivated was also extremely impressive. It might be a little exaggerated to say that it could shake the world, but it was easy to cultivate great divine abilities. However, the cultivation techniques that appeared after the Great Calamity were completely different. Due to the changes in the world's origin energy, only the truly exquisite supreme divine arts could be cultivated with the help of the innate origin energy among these newly born cultivation methods. There were even more ordinary cultivation methods, but they could only rely on the natural energy of heaven and earth, relying on the absorption of the natural energy of heaven and earth to raise the cultivator's cultivation level, to raise the cultivator's power and strength. As a result, the difference in the absorption of yuan qi naturally caused a huge difference in their final cultivation strength. It could be said that among the cultivation techniques that were born after the Great Calamity, even the most exquisite cultivation techniques could at most be compared to the ordinary cultivation techniques before the Great Calamity. However, this did not mean that the cultivation techniques created after the Great Calamity were worthless. On the contrary, the cultivation techniques created after the Great Calamity were even rarer. To the living beings after the Great Calamity, they were even more precious than the various cultivation techniques before the Great Calamity. The reason for this was not complicated. Firstly, the composition of the yuan qi in the world had changed. The cultivation techniques of the past were no longer suitable for the current primordial world. Even if living beings obtained the supreme divine techniques that absorbed the chaotic yuan qi in the past, where could they find the chaotic yuan qi that they could absorb? Secondly, even though these cultivation techniques that borrowed the postnatal origin qi of heaven and earth were much weaker than the cultivation techniques from before the Great Calamity, they were superior in that they had a stable foundation, allowing them to take one step at a time towards the peak. Although this path was several times longer than the cultivation techniques before the Great Calamity, it was dozens of times, hundreds of times, thousands of times, or even tens of thousands of times, it was far less dangerous. This cultivation method was naturally far more beneficial to the many living beings after the Great Tribulation of the world than the cultivation methods of the past. There were more and more living beings, and the cultivation civilization became more and more prosperous. The various mysteries of the primordial world were gradually excavated, revealing the shocking appearance hidden in the depths. Many cultivation techniques before the Great Calamity gradually spread, causing many living beings to yearn for and fear the world before the Great Calamity. As for the cultivation methods that had been unearthed, it gave the masses endless inspiration. More and more cultivation methods were created. They imitated these methods, but at the same time, they modified their foundations to make them more suitable for the current world and cultivation methods of the current world. These changes caused the cultivation civilization to become more and more prosperous. In the end, 10,000 years later, a cultivator who had become a perfected immortal finally appeared in the world. He possessed unimaginable mystical powers. He flew into the starry sky and found the ruins of the Moon Palace on the moon. He touched the remaining array formation of the Moon Palace and attracted the attention of Luo Fu and the others in the Bright Realm. The cultivation techniques after the Great Calamity had become difficult to absorb the connate primordial qi in the world. There were already traces of people pursuing longevity. Therefore, on the path of cultivation before longevity, they tried their best to be as fast as possible. They almost abandoned all other powers and only sought to raise their cultivation realm to the Tao of Immortals. In other words, they wanted to raise their cultivation realm to the itinerant immortal realm. Then, they would have an infinite lifespan. Only then would they begin to pursue power. Under this guidance, the cultivation techniques after the Great Calamity took far less time to reach the itinerant immortal realm than before the Great Calamity. Under normal circumstances, they would only need 1,000 years to truly achieve longevity. This speed was already unimaginably fast compared to the speed at which it took tens of thousands of years before the Great Calamity to reach the itinerant immortal realm. However, it was precisely because they abandoned all other powers and pursued longevity as quickly as possible that the itinerant immortal realm cultivated using this method was far weaker than the itinerant immortals before the Great Calamity. They were thousands of times weaker. This weakness caused the perfected immortal realm to be thousands of times weaker than the perfected immortal realm before the Great Calamity. After all, their foundation was already weak. Even if they made up for it later, they would not be able to change this foundation. They could only continue to be weak. Therefore, this perfected immortal who had touched the Moon Palace was tens of thousands of times weaker than Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo, let alone Luo Fu and the others. Although Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo had already reached the golden immortal realm, they were still tens of thousands of times stronger than this perfected immortal. This perfected immortal who had touched the Moon Palace was naturally nothing to Luo Fu and the others. However, at this moment, it happened to be the crucial moment for Guangpu to attain the Tai Fruit of Wei. This perfected immortal's touch caused the Moon Palace to tremble. It was transmitted into the bright realm and actually touched Guangpu's mind. She suddenly broke through some kind of barrier and suddenly saw the Tai in the unseen world. At this moment, the endless stars in the boundless starry sky transmitted streams of star essence to the moon at the same time. They surged into the bright realm through the Moon Palace and turned into boundless tribulation clouds that enveloped Guangpu. When the tribulation clouds appeared, the bright realm, which had already been upgraded to a medium-class world, instantly broke away from the control of Luo Fu and Guangpu. It seemed to have become a world that had nothing to do with them. It directly blasted them out of the state where they had merged with the bright realm, causing the four of them to appear in the void of the bright realm. After all, Guangpu was not Luo Fu. She did not have the boundless blessing of fate, nor did she have the help of the boundless power of will. Therefore, she could not attain the Tai Fruit of Wei naturally. It was precisely because of this that she needed to drag on for thousands of years. She even needed to borrow the perfected immortal's touch to break through the barrier and attain the Tai Fruit. It was also because she did not naturally obtain the primordial unity fruit of Tao. Therefore, the moment he obtained the primordial unity fruit of Tao, she touched the supreme great Tao of the primordial world. Thus, she used the power of the endless stars to condense this unbelievable tribulation cloud to wipe him out. The power produced by the gathering of such a huge amount of star essence was earth-shattering. Even the living beings in the untainted land below could see that the originally bright moon was suddenly covered by a faint layer of clouds. There was also an extremely terrifying aura brewing within, as if the moon would suddenly explode in the next moment. Such power could even be sensed by the living beings in the untainted land, let alone the perfected immortal on the moon. At that moment, the perfected immortal felt an indescribably powerful aura acting on his mind, making him feel as if he was carrying the weight of the entire untainted land. Such a weight, to him, had completely exceeded the limit of what he could bear. In an instant, the perfected immortal fell into a state of insanity. Endless light and shadows, endless sounds, and endless auras drowned him, making him feel as if he was experiencing millions of worlds at every moment. His mind seemed to be divided into billions of parts, undergoing endless tests at every moment. Such a change was almost a disaster for the perfected immortal. If this continued, it would only take a short period of time for his mind to really be divided into billions of parts. It would no longer be able to bear his body, and it would directly cause the celestial essence in his body to rebel, blasting him into powder. Then, his spirit would scatter, and he would directly disappear from the world. The perfected immortal was in front of the Moon Palace. Even though the bright world was currently enveloped in the boundless tribulation clouds, and all the connections between Luo Fu and Guang Pu and the bright world had been cut off. Everything that happened to the perfected immortal did not escape the senses of Luo Fu and Guang Pu. Although you did not mean it, Junior Sister's breakthrough opportunity was touched by you, and I do not want to see you die just like that. Oh well, let's see what kind of opportunity you have. Luo Fu had a thought and thought to himself. After thinking that, he did not hesitate and casually pointed a finger. A ray of light directly rushed out of the bright world and entered the perfected immortal's body. The ray of light did not contain any power, and it only contained a few hundred words of a technique. The technique was short and concise. Although it contained endless mysteries, it was unimaginably simple to cultivate. Let alone a perfected immortal, even a stupid creature that had just gained a bit of self-awareness would be able to easily learn it. At that moment, the perfected immortal's mind had been divided into billions of parts, and he had fallen into a state of complete insanity. Originally, he should not have been able to discover the technique contained within the ray of light, much less cultivate it. However, the technique was simply too profound. Even in this state, his mind was involuntarily attracted by the technique, and he could not help but circulate it according to the description of the technique. As the technique circulated, an indescribable suction suddenly descended on the perfected immortal's body from the unseen. In an instant, the perfected immortal's mind was sucked into an unimaginable place by this suction force. This was a boundless universe with huge nebulae, endless stars, and endless planets. The entire universe was filled with an endless amount of strange energy that contained endless vitality. This was the virtual world that Luo Fan had opened up based on the Yellow Springs network. The spiritual light that Luo Fu sent into the perfected immortal's body naturally contained the technique that Luo Fan had spread throughout the primordial world, which allowed his mind to enter the virtual world. The virtual world relied on the Yellow Springs network because it existed. Originally, after the Yellow Springs network disappeared, the virtual world should have lost its reliance and collapse. However, during the Great Tribulation of the world, the transformation of the Yellow Springs network had been under Luo Fan's control, and Luo Fan had been unwilling to give up on the virtual world. Thus, during the process, he had worked hard to maintain the fusion between the virtual world and the Yellow Springs network, so that after the Yellow Springs network had turned into the netherworld, the virtual world still existed. In fact, because the Yellow Springs network had turned into the netherworld, it had become even more stable and vast. However, after the Great Tribulation of the world, the technique that Luo Fan had imparted to the primordial world to enter the virtual world did not spread out. As a result, very few living beings had entered the virtual world over the years. Instead, it seemed countless times more desolate than before the Great Tribulation. The perfected immortal had never seen such an unbelievable technique or been to such a mysterious world. For a moment, he was dumbfounded. He almost wondered if he was dreaming. His doubts clearly could not last for long. Although his mind had entered the virtual world, his body was still in front of the Moon Palace. He was still enduring the impact of the endless essence of the stars. There was still endless pressure acting on his body, trying to pull his mind into a state of confusion. Even the virtual world could only barely isolate this kind of power. It could not completely eliminate it. It was precisely because of this that when he entered the virtual world, his mind was still a shadow. He had not been given a necessary body to survive in the virtual world by the rules of the virtual world. If this goes on, my mind will still be crushed. Although this world is mysterious, it doesn't seem to have much effect on me. The perfected immortal returned to his senses and could not help but sigh. His sigh seemed to have touched the spiritual light that Luo Fu had poured into his body. In an instant, the spiritual light trembled and completely collapsed, turning into a technique that was similarly short, mysterious, and easy to cultivate. The perfected immortal acted as if he had obtained a treasure. He circulated his mind according to the technique, and his mind suddenly trembled. It rose up and entered a long river of nothingness. He completely lost his sense of self, and the various pressures coming from his body instantly became illusory. Q.